Chapters 13 and 14 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Exploring the Subconscious, discusses automatic writing, the analysis of dreams, and other methods by which a whole new universe of life has been brought to human knowledge. One of the most common methods of exploring the subconscious mind is the method of automatic writing. I have never tried this myself, but tens of thousands of people are sitting every night with a Ouija board in front of them, holding a pencil on a piece of paper, and letting their subconscious minds write what they please. Most of them are hoping to get messages from the dead, a problem which we shall discuss in the next chapter. Suffice it for the moment to say that automatic writing and table rapping and other devices of mediumship have opened up to us a vast mass of subconscious mentality. A part of the scientific world still takes a contemptuous attitude and calls this all humbug. But many of our greatest scientists have been persuaded to investigate and have become convinced that in this mass of subconsciousness there is mingled not merely the mind of the medium, but the minds of all those present, and possibly other minds as well. For my part, I do not see how anyone can study disinterestedly the proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research and not become convinced that telepathy at least is one of the powers of the subconscious mind. Telepathy is what is popularly known as thought transmission. Everyone must know people who are what is called psychic, and will know what is happening to some friend in another part of the world, or will go upstairs because they sense that someone wants them, or will go to the door because they have a hunch that someone is coming. And maybe these things are only chance, but you will be unscientific if you do not take the trouble to read and learn what modern investigators have brought out on such subjects. This much is certain, and is denied by no competent investigator. Whatever has been in your mind is there still, and it is possible to find a way of tapping that buried memory. An old woman, delirious with fever, begins to babble in a strange language, and it is discovered that she is talking ancient Hebrew. The woman is entirely illiterate, and her conscious memory knows no language but her own. Her conscious mind has no ideas behind those of her domestic life and the gossip of the village. But investigation is made, and it is discovered that when this woman was a girl, she worked in the home of a Hebrew scholar, and heard him reading aloud. She did not understand a word of what she heard, and was not consciously listening to it. Nevertheless, every syllable of it had been stored away forever by her subconscious mind. Innumerable cases of this sort have been established, and, as a matter of fact, we might have been prepared for such discoveries by the memory feats of the conscious mind. It is well known that Mozart, when a child, could listen to a new opera and go home and play it over, note for note. At present there is a child in America, given exhibitions in public, carrying on 30 games of chess at the same time. There have been others who do sums of mental arithmetic, such as multiplying 32 figures by 32 figures, or reciting the Bible backwards. All this seems incredible, and yet there is something still more incredible. Suppose that these same powers, which are stored in our subconscious minds, were stored also in the minds of animals. A few years ago, Maurice Maeterlinck published a book, The Unknown Guest, in the course of which he tells about his experiments with the so-called Elberfeld horses. Two animals which had been trained for years by their owner to give signals by moving their forefeet, and which apparently could count and divide and multiply large sums, and extract square and cube root, and spell out names, and recognize sounds and scents and colors, and read time from the face of a watch. Of course, it is easy to say that this is absurd, that the horses must have got some signals from their trainer, but as it happened, they would do their work in the absence of their trainer. They would do it in the dark, or with a sack over their heads, and the best scientific minds of Germany were unable to suggest any test conditions which could not be met. There have been many gigantic frauds in the world, and this may have been one of them. On the other hand, there have been many new discoveries, and I, for my part, will finish exploring the miracles of the subconscious mind of man before I presume to say that anything is impossible in the subconscious mind of a horse or a dog. Also, I will wait for some learned person to explain to me how the subconscious minds of horses and dogs know enough to build and repair their bones and teeth so cleverly that modern architectural and engineering science could teach them nothing. I ask also if it is possible to find a region in the subconsciousness which is common to two people. Why is it absurd to suggest that there might be a region common to a man and a horse? Why is this any more absurd than that they should eat the same food and breathe the same air and feel the same affection and be frightened at the same dangers? The only persons who will be dogmatic about such subjects are the persons who are ignorant. Those who take the trouble to investigate discover more wonderful things every day, and they realize that we have here a whole universe of knowledge, to which we have as yet barely opened the doors. Consider, for example, the facts which we are acquiring on the subject of personality, and what it means. You would say, perhaps, that if there is anything you know positively, it is that you are one person, and have never been anybody else, and that your body belongs to you, and that nobody else ever has used or ever can use it. But what would you say if I told you that tomorrow you might cease to be, and somebody else might be in possession of your body, walking it around and wearing its clothes and spending its money? What if I were to tell you that there might be in you, or in your body, half a dozen different personalities which you have never known or dreamed of, and that tomorrow there might break out a war between them and you, as to which of the half dozen people should hear with your ears, and speak with your tongue, and walk about with your clothes on? Unless you are familiar with the literature of multiple personality, you would surely say that this was unbelievable, quite as much so as a mathematical horse. Let us begin with the case of Reverend Ansel Bourne, who was many years ago a perfectly respectable clergyman in a Rhode Island town. One day he disappeared, and his family did not hear of him. A year or two later, there was a storekeeper in a town in Pennsylvania who suddenly came to himself as the Reverend Ansel Bourne, not knowing what he had been in the meantime, or how he came to be keeping a store. Under hypnotism, it developed that he had in him two personalities, and his trance personality recollected all that had been happening in the meantime and told about it freely. Or take the still more fascinating case of a young lady who is known in the literature of psychotherapy as Miss Beauchamp. Her story is told in the book The Dissociation of Personality by Dr. Morton Prince of Boston. Some 30 years ago, Miss Beauchamp, a very conscientious and dignified young lady, became nervous and ill, and took to doing strange things which were a source of shame and humiliation to her. Under hypnotism, it was discovered to be a case of multiple personality. The other personality, who finally gave herself the name of Sally, was entirely different in character from Miss Beauchamp, being mischievous, vain, and primitive as a child. She conceived an intense dislike for Miss Beauchamp, whom she called by abusive names. At times, when she could get possession of Miss Beauchamp's body, she delighted in playing humiliating tricks upon her enemy, spending her money, running her into debt, breaking her engagements, disgracing her before her friends. Sally was always well and Miss Beauchamp was always ill. And Sally would take the body, for which they fought for possession, and take it for long and exhausting walks, and leave it cold and miserable, lost and penniless, in the possession of Miss Beauchamp. And of course this made Miss Beauchamp more and more a wreck, and Sally took possession of more and more of her time. Sally knew everything that Miss Beauchamp did and thought, but Miss Beauchamp did not know about Sally. She only knew that there were gaps in her life, during which she did things she could not explain. And because she did not want her friends to think her insane, she would try to hide this dreadful condition of affairs. But Sally would spoil her plans by writing letters to her friends, and also by writing insulting letters for Miss Beauchamp to find when she took possession again. Then one day, after several years of treatment, there appeared yet another personality, who knew nothing about Miss Beauchamp or Sally either, and only knew what Miss Beauchamp had known up to some years before. Miss Beauchamp had a college education, and wrote and spoke French. Sally knew no French, and tried in vain to learn it. The new personality did not have a college education at all. Nevertheless, after long experiment, the story of which is as fascinating as any novel you ever read, Dr. Prince discovered that this was the real Miss Beauchamp. The others were split-off personalities. He traced the cause to a severe mental shock, and succeeded in the end in combining the first Miss Beauchamp with the last, and in suppressing the obstinate and wanton Sally. As you read this story, you watch him mentally murdering a human being. Sally clamors pitifully for life, but he condemns her to death, and relentlessly executes his sentence. It is a movie thriller, with a happy ending, and I should think it would make disconcerting reading to persons who believe that each of us is one immortal soul, or has one immortal soul, and is responsible for it to a personal God. There is never any end to the problems of these multiple personalities, and each case is a test of the judgment and ingenuity of the specialist. He will try to make one personality stick, and will fail, and will have to accept another, or a combination of two. In one case, he found that he could not get the right personality to stick except under hypnosis. So he decided to leave the man in a mild state of trance, and the new personality lived all the rest of its life in that condition. If you wish to know more about this subject, you can find books in any well-equipped library. I mention one, The Riddle of Personality, by H. Addington Bruce, because it contains in the appendix an excellent list of the literature of the subconscious in all its many aspects. There is another and most fascinating method of exploring the underworld of the mind, and that is the study of dreams. Some 15 years ago, a psychotherapist in New York told me about the discoveries of a physician in Vienna, and gave me some pamphlets, written in very difficult and technical German. Since then, this Professor Freud has been translated and has become a fad, and the absurdities of his followers make one a little apologetic for him. But we do not give up Jesus because of the torturers and bigots who call themselves Christians, and in the same way, we have no right to blame Freud for all the absurdities of the psychoanalysts. Probably there never was a time in human history when there were not people who interpreted dreams, and you can still buy dream books for 25 cents and learn that a white horse means that you are going to get a letter from your sweetheart tomorrow, and then you can buy another dream book telling you that a white horse means that there is going to be a death in your family within the year. Naturally, this prejudices thinking people against dream analysis. Yet, dreams are facts, and every fact has its cause. And if you dream about a white horse, there must assuredly be some reason for your dreaming this particular thing. Of course, we know that if you eat mincemeat pie and Welsh rabbit at midnight, you'll dream about something terrible. But will it be snakes, or will it be a railroad wreck, or will it be white horses trampling over you? Obviously, it may be a million different unpleasant things. And what is it that picks out this or that from the infinite store of your memory and brings it into the region of half-consciousness, which we call dream? Professor Freud's discovery is, in brief, that the dream is a wish fulfillment. Our instincts present to our consciousness a great mass of impulses and desires, and among these the consciousness selects what it pleases and represses and refuses to recognize or to act upon the others. But maybe these decisions are not altogether satisfactory to the subconsciousness. The mind of the body is in rebellion against the mind, shall we say, of reason, or shall we say, of society. The mind of society, otherwise known as the moral law, says that you shall be a good little boy and shall go to school and learn what you are told, and on Sunday go to church and sit very still through a long sermon, whereas the body of a boy would rather be a savage, hunting birds' nests and scalping enemies and exploring magic caves full of precious jewels. So the subconsciousness of the boy, balked and miserable, awaits its time and finds its satisfaction when the boy is asleep and his moral censor has relaxed its control. This dream mind is not a logical and orderly thing like the conscious mind. It is not businesslike and civilized. It does not deal in abstractions. It is far more interested in things than in words. It does not present us with formulas, but with pictures and with stories of weird and wonderful happenings. It is like the mind of the race, which we study in legends and religions. It does not tell us that the sun is a mass of incandescent hydrogen gas, so and so many miles in diameter. It tells us that the sun is a cosmic hero who slays the black dragon of night. So the mind of our body presents us with innumerable pictures and symbols, exactly such as we find in poetry. There may be, and frequently is, dispute as to just what a poet meant by this or that particular image. But if we read all the work of any particular poet, we get a certain impression of that poet's individuality. If he is always talking about the perfume of women's hair and the gleam of the white flesh of nymphs in the thickets, we are not left in doubt as to what is wrong with this poet. And just so, when the expert sets to work to examine all the dreams that any one person can remember, day after day, sooner or later the expert observes that these dreams hover continually about one particular subject. And by questioning the person, he can find out what is the secret which is troubling the person, perhaps without the person himself being aware of it. Of course, there are many people who like nothing so much as to talk about themselves, and many are spending their time and their money on the latest fad of being psyched, who would, in any properly organized world, be put to work at hoeing weeds or washing their own clothes. Nevertheless, it is a fact that there are real mental disorders in the world, and innumerable honest and earnest people who have something the matter with them which they do not understand. Here is one way by which the conscientious investigator can find out what the trouble is and make it clear to them, and by establishing harmony between their conscious and their subconscious minds, can many times put them in a way of health and happiness. Through psychoanalysis, we are enabled to understand the split personality and its cause. We discover that almost everyone has more or less rudimentary forms of multiple personality hidden within them, made out of desires and traits which he does not like, or which the world forces him to drive into the deeps of his being. These may be evil impulses of sex or violence. They may be the most noble altruisms or artistic yearnings, ridiculous things in a world of hustle. A quite normal man or woman may keep a separate self, apart from the world, living a Jekyll life of business propriety and a Hyde life of religious or musical ecstasy. Or again, the repressed impulses may integrate themselves in the unconscious, and you may have genius or lunacy, or both, great wits to madness near allied. The modern knowledge on such dark mysteries you may find in Hart's The Psychology of Insanity. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. The Problem of Immortality discusses the survival of personality from the moral point of view. That is, have we any claim upon life, entitling us to live forever? As we explore the deeps of the subconsciousness, our own and other people's, we find ourselves confronting the strange question: is it all our own mind and that of other living people, or are we by any chance dealing with the minds of those who are dead? A great many earnest people, and some very learned people, are fully convinced that the latter is the case, and we have now to consider their arguments. When I was a little boy, I used to read and hear ghost stories, and would shudder over them. But I was given to understand that all this was just imagination. I must not take ghosts seriously, any more than fairies or dragons or nymphs or satyrs. For an educated person to take ghosts seriously, well, such a person would be almost as comical as that supremely comical person, the flying machine man. Would you believe it? In those days, there actually were people who believed that they could learn to fly in the air, and spent their time manufacturing machines for this purpose. There was a scientist in Washington who had this bug, and built himself a machine and started to fly, and he fell into the Potomac River. We all laughed at him. We laughed so long and so loud that we killed the poor man. And then, a few years later, somebody took that machine of Professor Langley's and actually did fly with it. But that was after I had grown up a bit more, and was not quite so ready to laugh at an idea because it was new. I remember vividly my first meeting with a man who believed in ghosts. He was a Unitarian clergyman, the Reverend Minot J. Savage of New York. I was 16 years old, and just breaking out of my theological shell, and Dr. Savage helped to pry me loose. He was a grave and kindly man, of great learning and intelligence, and I remember vividly my consternation when one day he told me, oh yes, he had seen many ghosts. He was accustomed to talk with ghosts every now and then. There was no doubt whatever that ghosts existed. He told me many stories. I remember one so well that I do not have to go back to his books to look up the details. It was in the days before the Atlantic cable, and he had a friend who took a steamer to England. One night Dr. Savage was awakened and found the ghost of his friend standing by his bedside. The ship had gone down off the Irish coast, so the ghost declared, but the friend did not want Dr. Savage to think that he had suffered from the pangs of drowning. He had been struck on the left side of the head by a beam of the ship, and had been killed instantly. Dr. Savage wrote down these circumstances and had them witnessed by a number of people, and 2 or 3 weeks later he received word that the body of his friend had been found on the Irish coast, with the left side of his head crushed in. So then, of course, I studied the subject of ghosts. I have studied it off and on ever since, and have read most of the important new discoveries and arguments of the psychic researchers. To begin with, I will mention the contents of 2 large volumes, Gurney's Phantasms of the Living. In this book are narrated many hundreds of cases, of which Dr. Savage's story is a type. It appears that persons at the moment of death, or in times of great mental stress, do somehow have the power to communicate with other people. even at the other side of the world. A few such cases might be attributed to coincidence or to fraud. But when you have so many cases, attested in minute detail by so many hundreds of otherwise honest people, you are not being scientific, but simply stupid, if you dismiss the whole subject with contempt. Gurney discusses the phenomenon and its probable causes. We know, of course, that hallucinations are among the most common of psychic phenomenon. Your subconscious mind can be caused to see and hear and feel anything. Likewise, it has power to cause you to see and hear and feel anything. In practically all cases of multiple personality, some of the split-off personalities can cause the others to see and hear and feel. And the consciousness, you must understand, takes these things to be just as real things. There is no way you can tell a hallucination from reality, except to ask other people about it. And if we admit the idea of telepathy, we may say that phantasms are hallucinations caused by this means. That is, the subconscious mind of your wife, or your mother, or your friend who is ill or dying, transmits to your subconscious mind some vivid impression, which causes your own subconscious mind to present to your consciousness a perfect image of that person walking and talking with you. And your consciousness has no way of telling but that the image is real. So much for phantasms of the living. But are there any phantasms of the dead? Are there any cases in which the time of the appearance can be proven to be subsequent to the time of death? Even this would not prove survival, of course. It is perfectly possible that the telepathic impulse might be delayed in our own minds. It might not flash into consciousness until our own state of mind made it possible. Can we say that there are cases in which the facts communicated are such as to convince us that the person was already dead, and was telling us something as a dead person, and not as a living one? Before we go into this question, let us clear the ground for the subject by discussing the survival of personality from a more general standpoint. What is it that we want to prove? What are the probabilities of its being true? What would be the consequences of its not being true? Have we any grounds, other than those of psychic research, for thinking that it is true, or that it may be true, or that it ought to be true? What, so to speak, are the morals of the doctrine of immortality? Well, to begin with, the survival of the soul after death and forever is one of the principal doctrines of the Christian religion. Many devout Christians will read this book, and I will seem to them blasphemous when I say that this argument does not concern me. I count myself one of the lovers and friends of Jesus. I am presumptuous enough to believe that if he were on earth, I would understand him and get along with him excellently. But I do not know any reason why I should believe this, that, or the other doctrine about life, because any religious sect founded upon the name of Jesus commands me so to believe. I see no more reason for adopting the idea of heaven because it is a Christian idea than I see for adopting the idea of reincarnation, because it is a precious and holy idea to hundreds of millions of Buddhists. I have some very good friends who are theosophists, and are quite convinced of this idea of reincarnation. That is, that the soul comes back to life over and over again in many different bodies, thus completing itself and renewing itself and expiating its sins. My theosophist friends have a most elaborate and complicated body of what they consider to be knowledge on this subject. Yet I have to take the liberty of saying that I cannot see that it has any relation to reality. It seems to me as completely unproven as any other fairy story or myth or legend. For example, the seven infernos of Dante, and the elaborate and complicated torments that are suffered there. But, it will be argued, Jesus rose from the dead, and thus proved the immortality of the soul. Now, in the first place, there are many learned investigators who consider there is insufficient evidence for believing that Jesus ever lived, and certainly if this be so, it will be difficult to prove that he rose from the dead. Again, it was a common occurrence for crucified men not to die. Sometimes it happened that their guards allowed them to be spirited away. Even nowadays we have known of prison guards being bribed to allow a prisoner to escape. Again, the events of the return of Jesus may have been just such psychic phenomena as we are trying in this chapter to explain. Or, once more, they may have been purely legends. A very brief study will convince a thinking person that the people of that time were ready to believe anything, and to accept facts upon such authority, and to make them the basis for a scientific conclusion, is simply to be childish. I shall be told, of course, that it is in the Bible, and therefore it must be true. The Bible is inspired, you say, and perhaps this is so, but then a great deal of other literature is inspired, and that does not relieve me of the task of comparing these various inspirations, and judging them, and picking out what is of use to me. The Bible is the literature of the ancient Hebrews for a couple of thousand years. It represents what the race mind of a great people for one generation after another judged worth recording and preserving. You may get an idea what this means if you will picture to yourself a large volume of English literature, containing some Teutonic myths, and the Saxon Chronicles, and the Morte d'Arthur, and several of Chaucer's stories, and some Irish fairy tales, and some of Bacon's essays, and Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, and the English Prayer Book, and the Architect's Specification for Westminster Abbey, and a good part of Burke's Peerage, also Blackstone's Commentaries, a number of Wesley's hymns, and Pope's Essay on Man, and some chapters from Carlyle's Past and Present, and Gladstone's speeches, and Blake's poems, and Captain Cook's story of his voyage around the world, and Southey's Life of Nelson, and Morris's News from Nowhere, and Blatchford's Merry England, and scores of pages from Hansard, which is the equivalent of our Congressional Record. You may find this description irreverent, but do not think it is meant so. Do me the honor to get out your Bible and look it over from this point of view. But if you say, if we die altogether when we finish this earthly life, what becomes of moral responsibility and the punishment of sins? What shall we say to the wicked man to make him be good, if we cannot reward him with a heaven and frighten him with a hell? Well, my first answer is that we have been trying this process for a couple of thousand years, and the results seem to indicate that we might better seek out some other method of inducing men to behave themselves. They do not believe so completely in heaven and hell these days, but there were times in history when they did believe completely, and not merely were the believers just as cruel, they were just as treacherous and just as gluttonous and just as drunken. If you want to satisfy yourself on this point, I refer you to my book, The Prophets of Religion, page 129. Now, as a matter of fact, I think I can discern the outlines of a system of rewards and punishments automatically working in the life of men. I am not sure that I can prove that the wicked always get punished and the virtuous always rewarded. Yet, when I stop and think, I am sure that I would not care to change places with any of the wicked people that I know in this world. Life may not always be getting them, but it has a way of getting their descendants. And I could not be entirely happy if I knew that my son and his sons were going to share the fate which I now observe befalling, for example, the Grand Dukes of Russia and their children. Life is one thing, and it does not exist for the individual, but for the race. Its causes and effects do not always manifest themselves in one individual, but in a line of descendants. Why are they called dynasties? Asked one of my professors of history, and a student brought the session to an end by answering, because that is what they always seem to do. But this is not perfect justice, you will argue. It is not perfect from the point of view of you or of me, but then I ask, what else is there in the world that is perfect from that point of view? Why should our justice be any more perfect than, for example, our health, or our thinking, or our climate, or our government? And may it not very well be that our justice is up to us in precisely the same way that some of these other things are up to us? Maybe what we have to do is to set to work to see to it that virtue does always get rewarded and vice does always get punished, right here and now, instead of waiting for an omnipotent God to attend to it in some hypothetical heaven. I find this life of mine very wonderful and enormously interesting. I am willing to take it on the terms that it is given, and to try to make the best of it, and I do not see that I have any right to dictate what shall be given me in some future life. If my father gives me a Christmas present, I am happy and grateful, and of course if I know that he is going to give me another present next Christmas, I am still more happy. But I do not see that I have any right to argue that because he gives me one Christmas present, he must give me an unlimited number of them. And I think it would be very ungrateful of me to refuse to thank him for a Christmas present until I made sure that I was going to get one the next time. Neither do I find myself such a wonderful person that I can assert that the morality of the universe absolutely depends upon the fact that I am immortal. Of course, I should like to live forever, and to know all the wonderful things that are going to happen in the world, and if it is true that I am so to live, I shall be immensely delighted. But I cannot say that it must be true. And all I can do is to investigate the possibilities. On this point my view is stated in a sentence of Spinoza's: "He who would love God rightly must not desire that God love him in return." To sum up, the question of immortality is purely a question of fact. It is one to be approached in a spirit of open-minded inquiry, entirely unaffected by hopes or fears or dogmas or moral claims. It is worth while to get clear that we may be immortal, even though we do not know it and cannot now prove it. It is possible that all psychic research might end in telepathy, and still, when we die, we might wake up and find ourselves alive. It might possibly be that some of us are immortal, and not all of us. It might be that some parts of us are immortal, but not the rest. It might be that our subconsciousness is immortal, and not our consciousness. It might be that all of us, or some part of us, survive for a time, but not forever. This last is something which I myself am inclined to think may be the case. Also, it seems worthwhile to mention that it is no argument against immortality that we cannot imagine it, that we cannot picture a universe consisting of uncountable billions of living souls, or what these souls would do to pass the time. It may very well be that among these souls there is no such thing as time. It may be that they are thoroughly occupied in ways beyond our imagining, or again, that they are not occupied, and under no necessity of being occupied. Let the person who presents such arguments begin by picturing to you how the brain cells manage to store up the uncounted millions of memories which you have, the thousands of words and combinations of words, and the thoughts which go with them, musical notes and tunes, colors and odors and visual impressions, memories of the past and hopes of the future and dreams that never were. Where are all these hundreds of millions of things, and what are they like when they are not in our consciousness? And how do they pass the time? And where were they in the hundreds of millions of years before we were born? And where will they be in the hundreds of millions of years of the future? When our wise men can answer these questions completely, it will be time enough for them to tell us about the impossibility of immortality. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Evidence for Survival. Discusses the data of psychic research and the proofs of spiritism thus put before us. Let us now take up the question of survival of personality after death, from the strictly scientific point of view. Let us consider what facts we have and the indications they seem to give. First, we know that to all appearances the consciousness and the subconsciousness are bound up with the body. They grow with the body, they decline with the body, they seem to die with the body. We can irretrievably damage the consciousness by drawing a whiff of cyanogen gas into our lungs, or by sticking a pin into the brain, or by clogging one of its tiny blood vessels with waste matter. It is terrible to us to think that the mind of a great poet or prophet or statesman may be snuffed out of existence in such a way. But then, it is no argument against the fact to say that it is terrible. Insanity is terrible, war is terrible, pestilence is terrible, so also are tigers and poisonous snakes. But all these things exist. And all these things have power over the wisest and greatest mind to put an end to its work, on this earth at least. And now we come with the new instrument of psychic research to probe the question, what becomes of this consciousness when it disappears? Can we prove that it is still in existence and is able by any method to communicate with us? Those who answer yes argue that the mind of the dead person, unable to use its own bodily machinery any longer, manages in the hypnotic trance to use the bodily machinery of another person, called a medium, and by it to make some kind of record to identify itself. This, of course, is a strange idea, and requires a good deal of proof. The law of probability requires us not to accept an unlikely explanation if there is any more simple one which can account for the facts. When we examine the product of automatic writing, table tipping, and other psychic phenomena, we have first to ask ourselves, is there anything in all this which cannot be explained by what we already know? Then, second, we have to ask, is there any other supposition which will explain the facts and which is easier to believe than the spirit theory? These spirits apparently desire to convince us of their reality, and they tell us many things which are expected to convince us. They tell us things which we ourselves do not know, and which spirits might know. But here again we run up against the problem of the subconsciousness, with its infinite mass of forgotten knowledge. It is not so easy for the spirits to tell us things which we can be sure our subconscious mind could not possibly contain. Also, there comes the additional element of telepathy. It appears to be a fact that under trance conditions, or under especially exciting conditions of the consciousness, one mind can reach out and take something out of another mind, or one mind can cause something to be passed over to another mind. And so information can be communicated to the mind of a medium, and can appear in automatic writing, or in clairvoyance, or in crystal gazing. One of the most conscientious and earnest of all the investigators of this subject was the late Professor Hyslop, who many years ago sought to teach me practical morality from the bourgeois point of view in Columbia University. Professor Hislop worked for 15 years with a medium by the name of Mrs. Piper, who was apparently sincere and was never exposed in any kind of fraud. In Professor Hislop's books, you will find innumerable instances of amazing facts brought out in Mrs. Piper's trances. You will find Professor Hislop arguing that the only way telepathy can account for these facts is by the supposition that there is a universal subconscious mind, or that the subconscious mind of the medium possesses the power to reach into the subconscious mind of every other living person and take out anything from it. But for my part, I cannot see that the case is quite so difficult. Professor Hislop recites, for example, how Mrs. Piper would tell him facts about some long-dead relative, facts which he did not know, but was later able to verify. But that proves simply nothing at all, because there could be no possible way for Professor Hislop to be sure that he had never known these facts about his relatives. The facts might have been in his subconscious mind without having ever been in his conscious mind at all. He might have heard people talking about these matters while he was reading a book, or playing as a boy, paying no attention to what was said. And then came Sir Oliver Lodge with his investigations. I will say this for his work. He was the first person who was able to make real to my mind the startling idea that perhaps after all the dead might be alive and able to communicate with us. You will find what he has to say in his book, The Survival of Man. And it seems fair that a great scientist and a great man should have a chance to convince you of what seem to him the most important facts in the world. Sir Oliver's son Raymond was killed in a war, and it is claimed that he began at once to communicate with his family. Among other things, he told them of the existence of a picture, which none of them had ever seen or heard of, a group photograph, which he described in detail. But of course, other people in this group knew of the existence of the photograph, and so we have again the possibility that some member of Sir Oliver's family may have taken into his subconscious mind, without knowing it, an impression or description of that picture. If you care to experiment, you'll find that you can frequently play a part in dreams of a child by talking to it in its sleep. And that is only one of 1,000 ways by which some member of a family might acquire, without knowing it, information of the existence of a photograph. There is another possibility to be considered, that a portion of the consciousness may survive, and not necessarily forever. We are accustomed when death takes place to see the body before us, and we know that we can preserve the body for thousands of years if we wish. Why is it not possible that when conscious life is brought to a sudden end, there may remain some portion of the consciousness or of the subconsciousness cut off from the body and slowly fading back into the universal mind energy, whatever we please to call it? There's a hard part of the body, the skeleton, which survives for some time. Why might there not be a central core of the mind, which is similarly tough and enduring? Of course, if consciousness is a function of the brain, it must decay as the brain decays. But how would it be if the brain were a function of the consciousness, which is, so far as I can see, quite as likely a guess? I find many facts which seem to indicate the plausibility of this idea. I notice that in trance phenomena, it is the spirits of those recently dead which seem to manifest the most vitality. Of course, you can go to any seance in the white light district of your city and receive communications from the souls of Caesar and Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Pocahontas. And if the medium does not happen to be literary, you can communicate with Hamlet and Don Quixote and Siegfried and Achilles. But you will not find much reality about any of these people. They will not tell you very much about the everyday details of their lives. This fact that so much of what the "spirits" tell us is of our own time tends to cast doubt on the idea that the dead survive forever. How simple it would be to convince us if the spirit of Sophocles would come back to earth and tell us where to dig in order to find copies of his lost tragedies. You would think that the soul of Sophocles, seeing our great need of beauty and wisdom, would be interested to give us his works. From genius, operating under the guidance of the conscious mind, we get sublimity, majesty, and power. But what the trance mediums give us suggests, both in its moral and intellectual quality, the operation of the subconscious. It is exactly like what we get, for example, from dissociated personalities. There are, to be sure, the books of Patience Worth, produced by the automatic writing of a lady in St. Louis, who tells us in evident good faith that her conscious personality is entirely innocent of Patience and all her thoughts and doings. Patience writes long novels and dramas in a quaint kind of old English, and the lady in St. Louis knows nothing about this language. But does she positively know that when she was a child, she never happened to be in the room with someone who was reading Old English aloud? Nothing seems more likely than that her subconscious mind heard some quaint, strange language, and took possession of it, and built up a personality around it, and even made a new language and a new literature from that starting point. That is precisely the kind of thing in which the subconscious revels. It creates new characters with an imagination infinite and inexhaustible. Who has not waked up and has been astounded at the variety and reality of a dream? Who has not told his dreams and laughed over them? The subconscious will play at games. It will act and rehearse elaborate roles. It will put on costumes and delight in being Caesar and Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Pocahontas and Hamlet and Don Quixote and Siegfried and Achilles. Yes, it will even play at being spirits. It will be mischievous and impish. It will be swallowed up with a sense of its own importance, taking an insolent delight in convincing the world's most learned scientists of the fact that its play acting is reality. It will call itself Raymond, to move and thrill a grief-stricken family. It will call itself Phinuit and Dr. Hodgson, and cause an earnest professor of practical morality to give up a respectable position in Columbia University and write books to convince the world that the dead are sending him messages. Consider, for example, the multiple personality of Miss Beauchamp. Remember that here we are not dealing with any guesswork about spirits. Here we have half a dozen different controls, none of them the least bit dead, but all of them a part of the consciousness of one entirely alive young lady. A specialist has spent some 6 years investigating the case, day after day, week after week, writing down the minute details of what happens. And now consider the miscreant known as Sally. Sally is just as real as any child whom you have ever held in your arms. Sally has love and hate, fear and hope, pain and delight. And Sally is a little demon, created entirely out of the subconsciousness of a highly refined and conscientious young college graduate of Boston. Sally spends Miss Beauchamp's money on candy and eats it. Sally pawns Miss Beauchamp's watch and deliberately loses the ticket. Sally uses Miss Beauchamp's lips and tongues to tell lies about Miss Beauchamp. Sally strikes Miss Beauchamp dumb, or makes her hear exactly the opposite of what is being spoken to her. Yes, and Sally pleads and fights frantically for her life. Sally enters into intrigues with other parts of Miss Beauchamp, and for years deliberately fools Dr. Prince, who is her recording angel and heavenly judge. And can anybody doubt that Sally could have fooled a grieving mother and made that mother think she was talking to the ghost of a long-lost child? Can anybody doubt that Sally could and would play the part of any person she had ever known, or of any historic character she had ever read about. And don't overlook the all-important fact that the conscious Miss Beauchamp was absolutely innocent of all this, and was horrified when she was told about it. So here you have the following situation, no matter of guesswork, but definitely established. Your dearest friend may act as a medium, and in all good faith may bring to the surface some part of his or her subconsciousness, which masquerades before you in 100 different roles, and plays upon you with deliberate malice the most subtle and elaborate and cruel tricks. And how much worse the situation becomes when to this there is added the possibility of conscious fraud. When the medium is a person who is taking your money and thrives by making you believe in the spirits she produces. You may go to Lilydale in New York State, the home of the spiritualists, where they have a convention every summer. And in row after row of tents you may hear and even see every kind of spirit you ever dreamed of, ringing bells, shaking tambourines, and dancing jigs. And you may see poor farmers' wives, with tears streaming down their cheeks, listening to the endearments of their dead children, and to wisdom from the lips of Oliver Wendell Holmes, speaking with a Bowery accent. This kind of thing was exposed many years ago by Will Irwin in a book called The Medium Game. And then, after traveling from one kind of medium to another, and studying all their frauds, Irwin tells how he went into a parlor on 6th Avenue, and there, by a fat old woman who had never seen him before, was suddenly told the most intimate secrets of his life. It has recently been announced that Thomas Edison is at work upon a device to enable spirits to communicate with the living, if there really are spirits seeking to do this. It is Edison's idea that spirits may inhabit a kind of infinitely rarefied astral body, and he proposes to manufacture an instrument which is sensitive to an impression many millions of times fainter than anything the human body can feel. This should make it easier for the spirits, and should constitute a fairer test, possibly a decisive one. When that machine is perfected and put to work by scientific men, I wish to suggest a few tests which will convince me that there really are spirits, and that the results are not to be explained by telepathy. First, assuming that the spirits live forever, there are some useful things which were known to the people of ancient time and are not known to anyone living now. For example, let one of the Egyptian craftsmen come forward and tell us the secret of their glass staining, which I understand is now a lost art. And then Sophocles, as I have already suggested, will tell us where we can find his lost dramas. Or if he doesn't know where any of the copies are buried, let him find in the spirit world some scribe or librarian or book lover who can give us this priceless information. All over the ancient lands are buried and forgotten cities, and in those cities are papyrus scrolls and graven tablets and bricks. Infinite stores of knowledge are thus concealed from us. And how simple for the ancient ones who possess this information to make it known to us, and so to convince us of their reality. Or again, supposing that spirits are not immortal, but that they slowly fade from life as do their bodies. Suppose that a Raymond Lodge or other recently dead soldier wishes to communicate with his father, and to convince his father that it is really an independent being and not simply a part of the father's subconscious mind. Let him try something like this. Let the father write 6 brief notes, and put them in 6 envelopes all alike, and shuffle them up and put them in a hat and draw out one of them. Now, assuming that the experimenter is honest, there is no living human being who knows the content of that envelope. And if the medium is dipping into the subconscious mind of the experimenter, the chances are 1 in 6 of the right note being hit upon. Assuming that spirits may not be able to get inside an envelope and read a folded letter, there is no objection to the experimenter, providing he is honest, and provided there are no mirrors or other tricks, holding the envelope behind his back, tearing it open, spreading it out for the convenience of the spirit. And now, if the spirit can read that letter correctly every time, we shall be fairly certain that whatever force we are dealing with, it is not the subconscious mind of the experimenter. Or let us take another test. Let us have a roulette wheel in a covered box, or hidden away so that no one but the spirit can see it. We spin the wheel, and any one of the habitués of Monte Carlo can figure out the chance of the little ball dropping into any particular number. If now the spirit can tell us each time where we shall find the ball, we shall know that we are dealing with knowledge which does not exist either in the conscious or the subconscious mind of any living human being. Among the things that spirits have been accustomed to do, since the days when they first made their appearance with the Fox sisters in America, are the lifting of tables and the ringing of bells and the assuming of visible forms. These are what is known as materializations. And when I was a boy and used to hear people talking about these things, there was always one test required. Let the materializations manifest themselves upon recording instruments scientifically devised. Let photographs be taken of them. Let them be weighed and measured, and so on. Well, time has moved forward, and these tests have been met, and it appears that materializations are facts, although it is still as uncertain as ever what they are materializations of. An English scientist, Professor Crawford, has published a book entitled "The Reality of Psychic Phenomena," in which he tells the results of many years of testing materializations by the strictest scientific methods. When the medium levitates a table, that is, causes it to go up in the air without physical contact, it appears that her own weight increases by exactly the weight of the table. When she exerts any force, which apparently she can do at a distance, the recording instruments show the exact counterforce in her own body. The results of these investigations are calculated at first to take your breath away. It begins to appear that the theosophists may be right, and that we may have one or more astral bodies within or coincident with the physical body, and that under trance conditions we mold and make over this astral body in accordance with our imaginations, precisely as a sculptor molds the clay. At any rate, our subconsciousness has the power to project from it masses of substance, and to cause these to take all kinds of forms, for example, human faces, which have been photographed innumerable times. Or the body can shoot out long rods or snaky projections which lift tables and exert force which has been recorded upon pressure instruments and weighed by scales. As I write, a friend lends me a $15 volume, a translation just published of an elaborate work by Baron von Schrenck-Notzing, a physician of Munich, giving minute details of 4 years' experiments in this field. So rigid was this investigator in his efforts to exclude fraud, that not merely was the medium stripped and sewed up in black tights, but the cabinet in which she sat was a big sack of black cloth, everywhere sewed tight by machine. Every crevice of the medium's body was searched before and after the tests, and every inch of the cabinet gone over. The investigator sat within a couple of feet of the medium, and would draw back the curtains, and while holding her hands and feet, would watch great masses of filmy gray and white stuff exude from the medium's mouth, from her armpits and breasts and sides. This would happen in red light of 100 candle power, by which print could easily be read, and the medium would herself illuminate the phenomena with a red electric torch. The investigators would be privileged to examine these phantom forms, to touch them gently and be touched by them, soft and slimy, like the tongue of an animal, but sometimes the things would misbehave and strike them in the eye, hurting them. The medium, a young French girl living in the home of the wife of a well-known French playwright, had begun with spiritualist ideas, but came to take a matter-of-fact attitude to what happened, and in her trances would labor to mold these emanations into hands or faces as requested by those present. She finally succeeded in allowing them to separate the soft mucus stuff from her body, and keep it for chemical and bacteriological examination. All this time she would be surrounded by a battery of cameras, 9 at once, some of them inside the cabinet. When the desired emanation was in sight, all of these cameras would be set off by flashlight, and in the book you have over 200 such photographs, showing faces and hands from every point of view. There are even moving pictures showing the material coming out of her mouth and going back. It is evident that we have here a whole universe of unexplored phenomena, and it seems that many of the old-time superstitions which were dumped overboard have now to be dragged back into the boat and examined in the light of new knowledge. What could smack more of magic and fraud than crystal gazing? Yet it appears that the subconsciousness has power to project an image of its hidden memories into a crystal ball, where it may be plainly seen. We find so well recognized an authority as Dr. Morton Prince using this method to enable one of the many Miss Beauchamps to recall incidences in her previous life, which were otherwise entirely lost to her. Likewise, this explanation of the disintegration of personality enables us to watch in the making all the phenomena of the trance and ecstasy, which have had so much to do with the making of religions. We know now how Joan of Arc heard the voices, and we can make her hear more voices, or make her stop hearing voices, as we prefer. Also, we know all about demons and demoniac possession. We can cast out demons, and without having to cause them to enter a herd of swine. We may someday be prepared to investigate the wonder stories which the yogis tell us about their ability to leave their physical bodies in a trance and to appear in England at a few moments' notice for the transaction of their spiritual business. But we want things proven to us, and we don't want the people with whom we work to be animated either by religious fanaticism or by money greed. We are ready to unlimber our minds and prepare for long journeys into strange regions, but we want to move cautiously and choose our route carefully and be sure we do not lose our way. We want to deal rationally with life. We don't want to make wild guesses or to choose a complicated and unlikely solution when a simple one will suffice. But on the other hand, we must be alive to the danger of settling down on our little pile of knowledge and refusing to take the trouble to investigate any more. That is a habit of learned men, I am sorry to say. The law of inertia applies to the scientist as well as to the objects he studies. The scientists of our time have had to be prodded into considering each new discovery about the subconscious mind, precisely as the scientists of Galileo's time had to be prodded to watch him drop weights from the Tower of Pisa. When he told them that the earth moved round the sun instead of the sun round the earth, they tortured him in a dungeon to make him take it back. And he did so, but whispered to himself, "And yet it moves." And it did move, of course, and continued to move. And in exactly the same way, if it be true that we have these hidden forces in us, they will continue to manifest themselves, and masses of people will continue to flock to Lily Dale and to pay out their hard-earned money until such a time as our learned men set to work to find out the facts and tell us how we can utilize these forces without the aid of either superstition or charlatanry. End of chapter 15. End of section 8. Chapters 16 and 17 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, The Powers of the Mind, sets forth the fact that knowledge is freedom and ignorance is slavery, and what science means to the people. We have now completed a brief survey of the mind and its powers. Whatever we may have proved or failed to prove, this much we may say with assurance. The reader who has followed our brief sketch attentively has been disabused of any idea he may have held that he knows it all. And this is always the first step towards knowledge. The mind is the instrument whereby our race has lifted itself out of beasthood. It is the instrument whereby we hold ourselves above the forces which seek to drag us down, and whereby we lift ourselves higher, if higher we are to go. How shall we protect this precious instrument? How shall we complete our mastery of it? What are the laws of the conduct of the mind? The process of the mind is one of groping outward after new facts and digesting and assimilating them, as the body gropes after and digests and assimilates food. The senses bring us new impressions, and we take these and analyze them, tear them into the parts which compose them, compare them with previous sensations, recognize difference in things which seem to be alike, and resemblances in things which seem to be different. We classify them and provide them with names, which are, as it were, handles for the mind to grasp. Above all, we seek for causes, those chains of events which make what we know as order in the world of phenomena. And when the mind has what it seems to be a cause, it proceeds to test it according to methods it has worked out, the rules and principles of experimental science. It is a comparatively small number of sensations which the body brings to the mind of itself. It is a narrow world in which we should live if our minds adopted a passive attitude toward life. But some minds possess what we call curiosity. They set out upon their own impulse to explore life. They discover new laws and make new experiences and new sensations for themselves. The mind forms an idea, and at first, after the fashion of the ancient Greek philosophers, it glorifies that idea and sets it in the seat of divinity. But presently comes the empirical method, which refuses authority to any idea unless it can stand the test of experiment, and prove that it corresponds with reality. Nowadays, the thinker amasses his facts and forms a theory to explain them, and then proceeds to try out this theory by the most rigid method that he or his critics can devise. If the theory doesn't work, that is, if it doesn't explain all the facts and stand all the tests, it is thrown away like a worn-out shoe. So, little by little, a body of knowledge is built up, which is real knowledge, which will serve us in our daily lives, which we can use as foundation stones in the structure of our civilization. By this method of research, man is expanding his universe beyond anything that could have been conceived in the pre-scientific days. Hour by hour, while we work and play and sleep, the mind of our race is discovering new worlds in which our posterity will dwell. For uncounted ages, man walked upon the earth surrounded by infinite swarms of bacterial life of whose existence he never dreamed. The invisible rays of the spectrum beat upon him, and he knew nothing of what they did to him, whether good or evil. He lifted his head and saw vast universes of suns, in comparison with which his world was a mere speck of dust. And yet, to him, these universes were globes or lanterns which some divinity had hung in the sky. One of the most fascinating illustrations of how the mind runs ahead of the senses is the story of the planet Uranus, which, less than 200 years ago, had never been beheld by the eye of man. A mathematician seated in his study, working over the observations of other planets, their motions in relation to their masses and distance, discovered that their behavior was not as it should be. At certain times none of them were in quite the right place, and he decided that this variation must be due to the existence of an unknown body. He worked out the problem of what must be the mass and the exact orbit of this body, in order for it to be responsible for the variations observed. And when he had completed these calculations, he announced to the astronomical world, "Turn your telescopes to a certain spot in the heavens, and at a certain minute of a certain night you will find a new planet of a certain size." And so, for the first time, the human senses became aware of a fact which by themselves they might not have discovered in all eternity. Now, the importance of exact knowledge concerning a new planet may not be apparent to the ordinary man, and if the thing which is discovered is, for example, an unknown ray which will move an engine or destroy a cancer, then we realize the worthwhileness of the research, and the masters of the world's commerce are willing to give here and there a pittance for the increase of such knowledge. But men of science, who have by this time come to a sense of their own dignity and importance, understand that there is no knowledge about reality which is useless, no research into nature which is wasted. You might say that to describe and classify the fleas which inhabit the bodies of rats and ground squirrels, and to study under the microscope the bacteria which live in the blood of these fleas, that this would be an occupation hardly worthy of the divinity that is in man. But presently, as a result of this knowledge about fleas and flea diseases being in existence and available, a bacteriologist discovers the secret of the dread bubonic plague, which hundreds of times in past history has wiped out a great part of the population of Europe and Asia. Mark Twain tells in his Connecticut Yankee how his hero was able to overcome the wizard Merlin, because he knew in advance of an eclipse of the sun. And this was fiction, of course, but if you prefer fact, you may read in the memoirs of Houdin, the French conjurer, how he was able to bring the Arab tribes into subjection to the French government by depriving the great chieftains of their strength. He gathered them into a theater and invited their mighty men upon the stage, and there was an iron weight, and they were able to lift it when Houdin permitted, and not to lift it when he forbade. These noble barbarians had never heard of the electromagnet, and could not conceive of a force that could operate through a solid wooden floor beneath their feet. Such things, trivial as they are, serve to illustrate the difference between ignorance and knowledge, and the power which knowledge gives. The man who knows is godlike to those who do not know. He may enslave them, he may do what he pleases with their lives, and they are powerless to help themselves. Anyone who would help them must begin by giving them knowledge, real knowledge. There is no such thing as freedom without knowledge, and it must be the best knowledge. It must be new knowledge. He who goes against new knowledge, armed with old knowledge, is like the Chinese who went out to meet machine guns with bows and arrows, and with umbrellas over their heads. Once upon a time, knowledge was the prerogative of kings and priests and ruling castes. But this supreme power has been wrested from them, and this is the greatest step in human progress so far taken. "Seek and ye shall find" is the law concerning knowledge today. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. In this, my book of the mind, I say to you that knowledge is your priceless birthright, and that you should repudiate all men and all institutions and all creeds and all formulas which seek to keep this heritage from you. Beware of men who bid you to believe something because it is told you, or because your fathers believed it, or because it is written in some ancient book, or embodied in some ancient ceremonial. Break the chains of these venerable spells, and at the same time beware of the modern spells which have been contrived to replace them. Beware of party cries and shibboleths, the idols of the forum, as Plato called them, the prejudices which are set as snares for your feet. Beware of cant, that paraphernalia of noble sentiments artificially manufactured by politicians and newspapers for the purpose of blinding you to their knaveries. Remember that you live in a world of class conflicts. At every moment of your life, your mind is besieged by secret enemies. It is exposed to poison gas clouds deliberately released by people who seek to make use of you for purposes which are theirs and not yours. In the fairy tales we used to love, the hero was provided with magic protection against the perils of those times. But what hero and what magic will guard the modern man against the propaganda of militarism, nationalism, and capitalist imperialism? The mind is like the body in that it can be trained, it can be taught sound habits. Its powers can be enormously increased. There are many books on mind and memory training, some of which are useful and some of which are trash. There is an English system widely advertised called Pelmanism, of which I have personally made no test, but it has won endorsements of a great many people who do not give their endorsements lightly. This is the subject of applied psychology, and just as in medicine, or in law, or in any of the arts, there is a vast amount of charlatanry, but there is also genuine knowledge being patiently accumulated and standardized. When the United States government had to have an army in a hurry, it did not make its millions of young men into teamsters or aviators at random. It used the new methods of determining reaction times and testing the coordination of mind and body. Recently I visited the Whittier Reform School in California, where delinquent boys are educated by the state. A boy had been set to work in a tailor shop, and it had been found that he was unable to make buttons and the buttonholes of a coat come in the right place. For 9 years the state of California, and before it the state of Georgia, had been laboring to teach this boy to make buttons and buttonholes meet. The effort had cost some $5,000, to say nothing of all the coats which were spoiled, and all the mental suffering of the victim and his teachers. Finally, someone persuaded the state of California to spend a few $1,000s and install a psychological bureau for the purpose of testing all the inmates of the institution. So by a half-hour's examination, the fact was developed that this boy was mentally defective. Although he was 18 years old in body, his mind was only 8 years old, and so he would never be able to achieve the feat of making buttons and buttonholes meet. This is a new science which you may read about in terms the measurement of intelligence. By testing normal children, it is established that certain tasks can be performed at certain ages. A child of 3 can point to his eyes, his nose, and his mouth. He can repeat a sentence of 6 syllables, and repeat 2 digits, and give his family name. Older children are asked to look at a picture and then tell what they saw, to note omissions in the picture, to arrange blocks according to their weight, to arrange words into sentences, to note absurdities in statements, to count backwards, and to make change. Children of 15 are asked to interpret fables, to reverse the hands of a clock, and so on. Of course, there are always variations. Every child will be better at some kinds of tests than at others. But by having a wide variety and taking the average, you establish a mental age for the child, which may be widely different from its physical age. You may find some whose minds have stopped growing altogether, and can only be made to grow by special methods of education. Enlightened communities are now conducting separate schools for defective children, replacing the old-fashioned schoolmaster who wore out the birch rods trying to force poor little wretches to learn what was beyond their power. In the same way, psychology can be applied in industry, and in the detection of crime. Here, too, there is a vast amount of fake, but also the beginning of a science. Our laws do not as yet permit the use of automatic writing and hypnotic trance in the investigation of crime, but they have sometimes permitted some of the simpler tests, for example, those of memory association. The examiner prepares a list of 100 names of objects, and reads those names one after the other, and asks the person he is investigating to name the first thing which is suggested to him by each word in turn. Engine will suggest steam, or perhaps it will suggest train. Coat will suggest trousers, or perhaps it will suggest pocket, and so on. The examiner holds a stopwatch and notes what fraction of a second each one of these reactions takes. The ordinary man, who is not trying to conceal anything, will give all his associations promptly, and the reaction times will be approximately alike. But suppose the man has just murdered somebody with an axe, and buried the body in a cellar with a fire shovel, and taken a pocketbook and a watch and a locket and a number of various objects, and climbed out of the cellar window by breaking the glass. And now suppose that in his list of 100 objects, the psychologist introduces unexpectedly a number of these things. In each case, the first memory association of the criminal will be one which he does not wish to give. He will have to find another, and that inevitably takes time. One or two such delays might be accidental, but if every time there is any suggestion of the murder, or the method or scene of the murder, there's a noticed confusion and delay, you may be sure that the conscious mind is interfering with the subconscious mind. The difference between the conscious and the subconscious mind is always possible to detect. And if you are permitted to be thorough in your experiments, you can make certain what is in the subconscious mind that the conscious mind is trying to conceal. Here, as everywhere in life, knowledge is power, and expert knowledge confers mastery over the shrewdest untrained mind. The only trouble is that under our present social system, the trained mind is very apt to be working in the interest of class privilege. The psychologist who is employed by a great corporation or by a police department may be as little worthy of trust as a chemist who is engaged in making poison gases to be used by capitalist imperialism for the extermination of its rebellious slaves. But what this proves is not that scientific knowledge is untrustworthy, but merely that the workers must acquire it. They must have their own organizations and their own experiments in every field. To give knowledge to the masses of mankind, slow and painful as the process seems, is now the most important task confronting the enlightened thinker. The method of psychoanalysis gives us also much insight into the phenomena of genius, and the hope that we may ultimately come to understand it. At present, we are embarrassed because genius is so often closely allied to eccentricity. The supernormal appears in connection with the subnormal, and it is often hard to tell them apart. Great poets and painters, in revolt against the world of smug commercialism, adopt irresponsibility as their religion. They live in a world of their own. They dress like freaks. They refuse to pay their debts or to be true to their wives. They are followed by a host of disciples who adopt the defects of the master as a substitute for his qualities. And so there grows up a perverted notion of what genius is, and wholly false standards of artistic quality. There is nothing mankind needs more than sure and exact tests of mental superiority, not merely the ability to acquire languages and to solve mathematical equations, but the ability to carry in the mind intense emotions, while at the same time shaping and organizing them by the logical faculty, selecting masses of facts and weaving them into a pattern calculated to awaken the emotion in others. This is the last and greatest work of the human spirit, and to select the men who can do it and foster their activity is the ultimate purpose of all true science. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. The Conduct of the Mind concludes the book of the mind with a study of how to preserve and develop its powers for the protection of our lives and the lives of all men. Someone wrote me the other day asking, "When is the best time to acquire knowledge?" I answer, the time is now. It is easier to learn things when you are young, but you cannot be young when you want to be, and if you are old, the best time to acquire knowledge is when you are old. It is true that the brain cells seem to harden, like the body, and it is less easy for them to take on new impressions, but it can be done, and just as Seneca began to learn Greek at 80, I know several old men whom the recent war has shaken out of their grooves of thought and compelled them to deal with modern ideas. But if you are young, then so much the better. Then the divine thrill of curiosity is keenest. Then your memory is fresh and can be trained. Your mind is plastic, and you can form sound habits. You can teach yourself to respect truth and seek it. You can teach yourself accuracy, open-mindedness, flexibility, persistence in the search of understanding. First of all, I think, is accuracy. Learn to think straight. Let your mind be as a sharp scalpel, penetrating unrealities and falsehoods, cutting its way to the facts. When you set out to deal with a certain subject, acquire mastery of it, so that you can say, "I know." And yet, never be too sure that you know. Never be so sure that you are not willing to consider new facts, and to change your way of thinking, if it should be necessary. I look about me at the world and see tigers and serpents, dynamites and poison gas and 42-centimeter shells. Yet I see nothing in the world so deadly to men as an error of the mind. Look at the mental follies about you. Look at all the prejudices, the delusions, the lies deliberately maintained, and realize the waste of it all, the pity of it all. Every man, it seems, has his pet delusions, which he hugs to his bosom and he loves because they are his own. If you try to deprive him of those delusions, it is as though you tore from a woman's arms the child she has borne. I have written a book called "The Profits of Religion," and never a week passes that there do not come to me letters from people who tell me they have read this book with pleasure and profit. They are grateful to me for teaching them so much about the follies and delusions of mankind. And it is all right and all true, save for 2 or 3 pages, in which I deal with the special hobby which happens to be their hobby. And it is all right and all true, save for the 2 or 3 pages in which I deal with the special hobby which happens to be their hobby. What I say about all the other creeds is correct, but I fail to understand that the Mormon religion is a dignified, inspired religion, a gift from on high, and if only I would carefully study the Book of Mormon, I would realize my error. Or it is all right, except what I say about Christian Scientists, or the Theosophists, or perhaps one particular sect of the Theosophists, who are different from all the others. Today there lies upon my desk a letter from a man who has read many of my books, and now is grief-stricken because he must part company from me. He discovers that I permit myself to speak disrespectfully about the Seventh-day Adventist religion, whereas he is prepared to show the marvels of biblical prophecy now achieving themselves in the world. How could any save a divinely revealed religion have foreseen the present movement to establish the Sabbath by law? Yes, and presently I shall see the last atom of the prophecy fulfilled. There will be a death penalty for failure to obey the Sabbath law. Cultivate the great and precious virtue of open-mindedness. Keep your thinking free, not merely from outer compulsion, but from the more deadly compulsions of its own making, from prejudices and superstitions. The prejudices and superstitions of mankind are like those diseased mental states which are discovered by the psychoanalyst, which he calls a complex in the subconscious mind, a tangle or knot which is a center of disturbance and keeps the whole being in a state of confusion. Each group of men, each sect or class, have their precious dogmas, their shibboleths, their sacred words and stock phrases, which set their whole beings aflame with fanaticism. They also have their phobias, They're words of terror, which cannot be spoken in their presence without causing a brainstorm. At present, the dread word of our time is communist. You can scarcely say the word without someone telephoning for the police. And yet, when you meet a communist, what is he? A worn and fragile student who has thought out a way to make the world a better place to live in, and whose crime is what he tells others about his idea. Or perhaps you belong to the other side, and then the word of terror is the word capitalist. You meet a capitalist, and what do you find? Very likely you find a man who is kindly generous in his personal impulses, but bewildered, possibly a little frightened, and still more irritated and made stubborn. So you realize that nearly all men are better than the institutions and systems under which they live. You realize the urgent need of applying your reasoning powers to the problem of social reorganization. Cultivate also in the affairs of your mind the ancient virtue of humility. There is an old-time poem, which perhaps was in your school readers. Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud? My answer is, for innumerable reasons. The spirit of mortal should be proud and must be proud because life throbs in it, and because life is a marvelous thing, and the excitement of life is perpetual. Yesterday I met a young mother, and of what avail is all the pessimism of the poets against the pride of a young mother? "Oh," she cried, and her face lighted up with delight, "he said 'goo!'" Yes, he said "goo," and never since the world began had there been a baby which had achieved that marvel. Presently it will be, "Look, look, he's trying to walk." Then he will be getting marks at school, and presently he will be displaying signs of genius. Always it will take an effort of the mind of that young mother to realize that there are other children in the world as wonderful as her own, and perhaps it will take many generations of mental effort before there will be young mothers capable of realizing that some other child is more wonderful than her child. In other words, it is by a definite process of broadening our minds that we come to realize the lives of others, to transfer to them the interest we naturally take in our own lives, and to admit them to a state of equality with ourselves. This is one of the services the mind must render for us. It is the process of civilizing us. And there is another, and yet more important task, which is to make clear to us the fact that we do not altogether make this life of ours, that there is a universe of power and wisdom which is not ours, but on which we draw. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," said the psalmist. We know now that fear is an ugly emotion, destructive to life, but it may be purified and made into a true humility which every thinking man must feel towards life and its miracles. Also, the man will have joy, because it is given to him to share the high, marvelous adventure of being. To the pleasures of the body there is a limit, and it comes quickly. But the pleasures of the mind are infinite, and no one who truly understands them can have a moment of boredom in life. To a man who possesses the key to modern thought, who knows what knowledge is and where to look for it, the life of the mind is a panorama of delight perpetually unrolled before him. To the minds of our ancestors there was one universe, but to our mind there are many universes, and new ones continually discovered. The only question is, which one will you choose? Will you choose the universe of outer space, the material world of infinity? Consider the smallest insect that you can see, crawling upon the surface of the earth. Small as that insect is in relation to the earth, it is not so small by millions of times as is the earth in relation to the universe made visible to our eyes by the high-powered telescope, plus the photographic camera, plus the microscope. If you want to know the miracles of this world of space, read Arrhenius's The Life of the Universe, or Simon Newcomb's Sidelights on Astronomy. Suffice it here to say that we have a chemistry of the stars by means of the spectroscope, that we can measure the speed and direction of stars by the same means that we have learned to measure the size of the stars, and are studying stars which we cannot even see. And then along comes Einstein with his theories of relativity, and makes it seem that we have to revise a great part of this knowledge to allow for the fact that not merely everything we look at, but also we ourselves, are flying every which way through space. Or will you choose the universe of the atom, the infinity of the material world, followed the other way, so to speak? Big as the universe is in relation to our world, and big as our world is in relation to the insect that crawls on it, the insect is bigger yet in relation to the molecules which compose its body, and these in turn are millions of times bigger than the atoms which compose them. And then, behold, in the atom there are millions and millions of electrons, tiny particles of electric energy. We cannot see these infinitely minute things any more than we can see the electricity which runs our trolley cars, but we can see their effects, and we can count and measure them, and deal with them in complicated mathematical formulas, and be just as certain of their existence as we are of the dust under our feet. If you wish to explore this wonderland, read Duncan's The New Knowledge, or Dr. Henry Smith Williams' Miracles of Science. Or will you choose the universe of the subconscious, our racial past locked up in the secret chambers of our mind? Or will you choose the universe of the superconscious, the infinity of genius manifested in the arts? By the device of art, man not merely creates new life, he tests it, he weighs it and measures it, he tries experiments with it, as the physicist with the molecule and the astronomer with light. He finds out what works and what does not work, and so develops his moral and spiritual muscles, training himself for his task as a maker of life. Written words can give but a feeble idea of the wonders that are found in these enchanted regions of our minds. Here are palaces of splendor beyond imagining. Here are temples with sacred shrines, and treasure chambers full of gold and priceless jewels. Into these places we enter as Aladdin in the ancient tale. We are the masters here, and all that we see is ours. He who has once got access to it, he possesses not merely the magic lamp, he possesses all the wonderful fairy properties of all the tales of our childhood. He is the Tarnhelm, and the magic ring which gives him power over his foes. His is the sword Excalibur, which none can break, and the silver bullet which brings down all game, and the flying carpet upon which to travel over the earth, and the house made of gingerbread, and the 3 wishes which always come true, and the philter of love, and the elixir of youth, and the music of the spheres, and who knows? Some day he may come upon heaven, with St. Peter and his golden key, and the seraphim singing, and the happy blessed conversing. End of chapter 17. End of the Book of the Mind. End of section 9. Book 2, Chapter 18 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, the Book of the Body. Chapter 18, the Unity of the Body, discusses the body as a whole, and shows that health is not a matter of many different organs and functions, but is one problem of one organism. The reader who has followed our argument this far will understand that we are seldom willing to think of the body as separate from the mind. The body is a machine, to be sure, but it is a machine that has a driver. And while it is possible for a sound machine to have a drunken and irresponsible driver, such a machine is not apt to remain sound very long. Frequently, when there's trouble with the machine, we find the fault to be with the driver. In other words, we find that what is needed for the body is a change in the mind. If you wish to have a sound body, and to keep it sound as long as possible, the first problem for you to settle is what you want to make of your life. You must have a purpose, and confront the tasks of life with energy and interest. What is the use of talking about health to a man who has no moral purpose? He may answer, indeed I have heard victims of alcoholism answer, "Let me alone. I have a right to go to hell in my own way." I am aware, of course, that the opposite of the proposition is equally true. A man cannot enjoy much mental health while he has a sick body. It is a good deal like the old question, which comes first, the hen or the egg? The mind and the body are bound up together, and you may try to deal with each by turn, but always you find yourself having to deal with both. Most physicians have a tendency to overlook the mind, and Christian Scientists make a religion of overlooking the body, and each pays the penalty in greatly reduced effectiveness. My first criticism of medical science as it exists today is that it has a tendency to concentrate upon organs and functions, and to overlook the central unity of the system. You will find a doctor who specializes in the stomach and its diseases, and is apt to talk as if the stomach were a thing that went around in a world all by itself. He will discuss the question of what goes into your stomach, and overlook to point out to you that your stomach is nourished by your bloodstream, which is controlled by your nervous system, which in turn is controlled by hope, by ambition, by love, by all the spiritual elements of your being. A single pulse of anger or of fear may make more trouble with the contents of your stomach than a doctor's pepsins and digestive ferments can remedy in a week. Of course, you may do yourself some purely local injury, and so for a time have a purely local problem. You may smash your finger, and that is a problem of the finger. But neglect it for a few days, and let blood poison set in, and you will be made aware that the human body is one organism, and also that, in spite of any metaphysical theories you may hold, your body does sometimes dominate and control your mind. Someone has said that the blood is the life, and certainly the blood is both the symbol and the instrument of the body's unity. The blood penetrates to all parts of the body and maintains and renews them. If the blood is normal, the work of renewal does not often fail. If there is a failure of renewal, that is, a disease, we shall generally find an abnormal condition of the blood. The distribution of the blood is controlled by the heart, a great four-chambered pump. One chamber drives the blood to the lungs, a mass of fine porous membranes where it comes into contact with the air and gives off the poisons which it has accumulated in its course through the body, and takes up a fresh supply of oxygen. By another chamber of the heart, the blood is then sucked out of the lungs, and by the next chamber it is driven to every corner of the body. It takes to every cell of the body the protein materials which are necessary for the body's renewal, and also the fuel materials which are to be burned to supply the body's energy. Also, it takes some 30 million millions of microscopic red corpuscles, which are the carriers of oxygen, and an even greater number of the white corpuscles, which are the body's scavengers, its defenders from invasion by outside germs. There are certain outer portions of the body, such as nails and the scales of the skin, which are dead matter produced by the body and pushed out from it, and no longer nourished by the blood. But all the still living parts of the body are fed at every instant by the stream of life. Each cell in the body takes the fuel which it needs for its activities, and combines it with the oxygen brought by the red corpuscles. And when the task of power production has been achieved, the cell puts back into the bloodstream not merely the carbon dioxide, but many complex chemical products, ammonia, uric acid, and the fatigue poisons indol, phenol, and skatol. The bloodstream bears these along and delivers some to the sweat glands to be thrown out, and some to the kidneys, and the rest to the lungs. All of this complicated mass of activities is in normal health perfectly regulated and timed by the nervous system. You lie down to sleep, and your muscles rest, and the vital activities slow up. Your heart beats only faintly, but let something frighten you, and you sit up, and these faculties leap into activity. Your heart begins to pound, driving a fresh supply of blood and vital energy. You jump up and run, and these organs all set to work at top speed. If they did not do so, your muscles would have no fresh energy. They would become paralyzed by the fatigue poisons, and you would be, as we say, exhausted. All the rest of the body might be described as a shelter and accessory to the life-giving bloodstream. All the rest is the bloodstream's means of protecting itself and renewing itself. The stomach is to digest and prepare new blood material. The teeth are to crush it and grind it. The hands are to seize it. The eyes are to see it. The brain is to figure out its whereabouts. Man, in his egotism, imagines his little world as the center of the universe. But the wise old fellow who lives somewhere deep in the subconsciousness and looks after the welfare of our bloodstream, he has far better reason for believing that all our consciousness and personality exist for him. Now, disease is some failure of this bloodstream properly to renew itself, or properly to protect itself and its various subsidiary organs. When you find yourself with a disease, you call in a doctor, and unless this doctor is a modern and progressive man, he makes the mistake of assuming that the disease is in the particular organ where it shows itself. You have, let us say, follicular tonsillitis. These medical men have a love for long names, which have the effect of awing you and convincing you that you are in desperate need of attention. Your throat is sore, your tonsils are swollen and covered with white spots. So the doctor hauls out his little black bag and makes a swab of cotton and dips it, say in Lysol, and paints your tonsils. He knows by means of the microscope that your tonsils are covered and filled with a mass of foreign germs, which are feeding upon them. Also he knows that Lysol kills these germs, and he gives you a gargle for the same purpose, puts you to bed, and gradually the swelling goes down. And he tells you that he has cured you, and sends you a bill for services rendered. But maybe the swelling does not go down. Maybe it gets worse and you die. Then he tells your family that nature was to blame. Nature is to blame for your death, but it never occurs to anyone to ask what nature may have had to do with your recovery. I do not know how many thousands of diseases medical science has now classified, and for each separate disease there are complex formulas, and your system is pumped full of various mineral and vegetable substances which have been found to affect it in certain ways. Perhaps you have a fever. Then we give you a substance which reduces the temperature of your bloodstream. It never occurs to us to reflect that maybe nature has some purpose of her own in raising the temperature of the blood. And this might be, so to speak, the heat of conflict, a struggle she is waging to drive out invading germs. And that possibly it would be better for the temperature to stay up until the battle is over. Or maybe the heart is failing. Then our medical man is so eager to get something into the system that he cannot wait for the slow process of the mouth and stomach. He shoots some strychnine directly into the bloodstream. It does not occur to him to reflect that maybe the heart is slowing up because it is overloaded with fatigue poisons, of which it cannot rid itself, and that the effect of stimulating it into fresh activity will be to leave it more dangerously poisoned than before. We are dealing here with processes which our ancient Mother Nature has been carrying on for a long time, and which she very thoroughly understands. We ought therefore to be sure that we know what is the final effect of our actions. More especially we ought to be sure that we understand the cause of the evil, so that we may remove it, and not simply waste our time treating symptoms, putting plasters on cancer. This is the fundamental problem of health, and in order to make clear what I mean, I am going to begin by telling a personal experience, a test which I made of medical science some 12 or 14 years ago, in connection with one of the simplest and most external of the body's problems, the hair. First, I will tell you what medical science was able to do for my hair, and second, what I myself was able to do when I put my own wits to work on the problem. I had been overworking, and was in a badly run-down condition. I was having headaches, insomnia, ulcerated teeth, many symptoms of a general breakdown. Among these, I noticed that my hair was coming out. I decided that it was foolish to become bald before I was 30, and that I would take a little time off, and spend a little money, and have my hair attended to. I did not know where to go, but I wanted the best authority available, so I wrote to the superintendent of the largest hospital in New York, asking him for the name of a reliable specialist in diseases of the scalp. The superintendent replied by referring me to a certain physician who was the hospital's consulting dermatologist. And I went to see this physician, whose home and office were just off Fifth Avenue. He examined my scalp, and told me that I had dandruff in my hair, and that he would give me a prescription which would remove this dandruff and cause my hair to stop falling out. He charged me $10 for the visit, which in those days was more money than it is at present. Being of an inquiring turn of mind, I tried to get my money's worth by learning what there was to learn about the human hair. I questioned this gentleman, and he told me that the hair is a dead substance, and that its only life is in the root. He explained that barbers often persuade people to have their hair singed to keep it from falling out, and that this was an utterly futile procedure, and likewise all shampooing and massage, which only caused the hair to fall out more quickly. It was better even not to wash the hair too often. All that was needed was a mixture of chemicals to kill the dandruff germs, and so I had the prescription put up at a drugstore, and for a couple of years I religiously used it according to order, and it had upon my hair absolutely no effect whatsoever. So here was the best that medical science could do, but still I did not want to be bald. So I went among the health cranks, people who experiment without license from the medical schools. Also I experimented upon myself, and now I know something about the human hair, something entirely different from what the rich and successful consulting dermatologist taught me, but which has kept me from becoming entirely bald. First, the human hair is made by the body, and it is made, like everything else in the body, out of the bloodstream. It is perfectly true that the dandruff germ gets into the roots and makes trouble, and that the process of killing this germ can be helped by chemicals. But it does not take a $10 prescription. It only takes 10 cents worth of borax and salt from the corner grocery. Put a little into a saucer, moisten it, rub it onto the scalp, wash it out again. But infinitely more important than this is the fact that healthy hair roots are a product of healthy blood, and that unhealthy blood produces sick hair roots, which cannot hold in the hair. Most important of all is the fact that in order to make healthy hair roots, the blood must flow fully and freely to these hair roots, whereas I had been accustomed for many hours every day of my life to clap around my scalp a tight band, which almost entirely stopped the circulation of life-giving blood to my sick hair roots. In other words, by wearing civilized hats, I was literally starving my hair to death. As soon as I realized this, I took off my civilized hat, and have never worn one since. As a rule, I don't wear anything. On the few occasions when I go into the city, I wear a soft cap. Now and then, I experience inconvenience from this. The elevator boy in some apartment house tells me to come in by the delivery entrance, or the porter of a sleeping car will not let me in at all. I remember discussing these embarrassments with Jack London, who went even further in his defiance of civilization, and wore a soft shirt. It was his custom, he said, to knock down the elevator boys and sleeping car porters. I realized that that might be all right for him, because he could do it, whereas I was reduced to the painful expedient of explaining politely why I went about without the customary symbols of my economic superiority. The consulting dermatologist had very solemnly and elaborately warned me concerning the danger of moving my hair too violently, and thus causing it to come out. But now my investigations brought out the fact that moving the hair, that is, massaging the scalp, increases the flow of blood to the hair roots and further increases resistance to disease. As for causing the hair to fall out, I discovered that the more quickly you cause a hair to fall out, the greater is the chance of your getting another hair. If a hair is allowed to die in the root, it kills that root forever. But if it is pulled out before it dies, the root will make a new hair. Every beauty parlor specialist knows this. She knows that if a hair is pulled, it grows back bigger and stronger than ever, and so to pull out hair is the last thing you must do if you want to get rid of hairs. I know a certain poet who happens to have been well endowed with physical graces by our Mother Nature. He finds it worthwhile to preserve them, they being accessory to those amorous experiences which form so large a part of the theme of poetry. Anyhow, this poet values his beautiful hair, and you will see him sitting in front of his fireplace reading a book, and meanwhile his fingers run here and there over his head, and he grabs a bunch of hair and he pulls and twists it. He has cultivated this habit for many years, and as a result his hair is as thick and heavy as the fuzzy wuzzies of Kipling's poems. It is a favorite sport of this poet to lure some rival poet into a contest. He will mildly suggest that they take hold of each other's hair and have a tug of war. The rival poet, all unsuspecting, will accept the challenge, and my friend will proceed to haul him all over the place to the accompaniment of howls of anguish from the victim, and howls of glee from the victor, who has, of course, a scalp as tough as a rhinoceros hide. I am not a poet, and it is not important that I should be beautiful, and I have been too busy to remember to pull my hair, but by giving up tight hats and by limiting the amount of my overworking, I have managed to keep what hair I had left when the hair specialist had got through with me. I tell this anecdote at the beginning of my discussion of health because it illustrates so well the factors which appear in every case of disease, and which you might understand in seeking to remedy the trouble. We have a phrase which has come down to us from the ancient Latins, vis medicatrix naturae, which means the healing power of nature. So long ago men realized that it is our ancient mother who heals our wounds, and not the physician. Out of this have grown the cults of nature cure enthusiasts, and according to the fashion of men, they fly to extremes just as unreasonable and as dangerous as those of the pill doctors they are opposing. I have in mind a man who taught me probably more than any other writer on health questions, and with whom I once discussed the subject of typhoid, how it seemed to affect able-bodied men in the prime of their physical being. This, of course, was contrary to the theories of nature cure, and my friend had a simple way of meeting the argument. He refused to believe it. He insisted that, as with all other germ infections, it must be a question of bodily tone. No germ could secure lodging in the human body unless the body's condition was reduced. But how can you be sure of that? I argued. You know that if you go into the jungle, you are not immune against the scorpion or the cobra or the tiger. There is nothing in all nature that is safe against every enemy. What possible right have you to assert that you are immune against every enemy which can attack your bloodstream? We shall find here, as we find nearly always, that the truth lies somewhere between the extremes of two warring schools. Our race has been existing for a long time in a certain environment, and its very existence implies superiority to that environment. The weaklings for whom its hardships were too severe were weeded out. Hostile parasites invaded their bloodstream and conquered and devoured them. But those who survived were able to make in their bloodstream the substance known as antibodies, the opsonins, to help the white blood corpuscles devour the germs. As a result of their victory, we carry those antibodies in our system, which gives us immunity to those particular diseases, or at any rate gives us the ability to have the diseases without dying. Every time we go into a streetcar, we take into our throat and lungs the germs of tuberculosis. Examination proves that we carry around with us in our mouths the germs of all the common throat and nose diseases, colds, bronchitis, tonsillitis. No matter what precautions we might take, no matter if we were to gargle our throats every few minutes, we could never get rid of such germs. And they wage continual war upon the body's defenses. They batter in vain upon the gates of our sound health. But take us to some new environment to which we are not accustomed. Take us to Panama in the old days of yellow fever, or take us to Africa and let the tsetse fly bite us and infect us with sleeping sickness. Here are germs to which our systems are not accustomed, and before them we are as helpless as the ancient knights at arms who had conquered everything in sight and ruled the continent of Europe for many hundreds of years, but were wiped off the earth by a chemist mixing gunpowder. In the Marquesas Islands, in the South Seas, there lived a beautiful and happy race of savages, believed to have been descended long ages ago from Aryan stock. From the point of view of physical perfection, they were an ideal race, living a blissful outdoor life, which you may read about in Melville's Typee, and in O'Brien's White Shadows in the South Seas. This race conformed to all the requirements of the nature enthusiast. They went practically naked, their houses were open all the time, they lived on the abundant fruits of the earth. To be sure, they were cannibals, but this was more a matter of religious ceremony than of diet. They ate their war captives, but this was only after battle, and not often enough to count, one way or the other, in matters of health. They had lived for uncounted ages in perfect harmony with their environment. They were happy and free, and certainly, if such a thing were possible to human beings, they should have been proof against germs. But a ship came to one of these islands and put ashore a sailor dying of tuberculosis. And in a few years, 4/5 of the population of this island had been wiped out by the disease. What tuberculosis left were finished by syphilis and smallpox, and today the Marquesans are an almost extinct race. But there is another side to the argument, and one more favorable to the nature cure enthusiast. We civilized men, by soft living, by self-indulgence and lack of exercise, may reduce the tone of our body too far below the standard which our ancestors set for us. And then the common disease germs get us. Then we have colds, sore throats, tuberculosis. The nature cure advocate is perfectly right in saying that there is no use treating such diseases. The thing is to restore the body to its former tone, so that we may be superior to our normal environment and its strains. You know the poem of the one-horse shay, which was so perfectly built in every part that it ran for 50 years and then collapsed all at once in a heap. But the human body is not built that way. It always has one or more places which are weaker than the others, and which first show the effects of strain. In one person it will take the form of dyspepsia, in another it will be headaches, in another colds, in another decaying teeth, in another hardening of the arteries or stiffening of the joints. But whatever the symptoms may be, the fundamental cause is always the same: an abnormal condition of the bloodstream, and a consequent lowering of the body's tone. Therefore, studying any disease and its cure, you have first the emergency question: are there any germs lodged in the body? And if so, how can you destroy them? As part of the problem, you have to ask whether the bloodstream is normal, and if not, what are the methods by which you can make it normal and keep it so? Also, you have to ask, what are the reasons why your trouble manifests itself in this or that particular organ? Is there some weakness or defect there, and can the defect be remedied? Or can your habits be changed so as to reduce the strain on that organ? Are there any measures you can take to increase the flow of blood to that organ and to promote its activity? In the study of your health, you will find that circumstances differ, and the importance of one factor or the other will vary. But you will seldom find any problem in which all these factors do not enter, and you will seldom find an adequate remedy unless you take all the factors into consideration. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, Experiments in Diet, narrates the author's adventures in search of health and his conclusions as to what to eat. Students of the body assure us that every particle of matter which composes it is changed in the course of 7 years. It is obvious that everything that is a part of the body has at some time to be taken in as food. So the problem of our diet today is the problem of what our body shall consist of 7 years from now, and probably a great deal sooner. I begin this discussion by telling my own personal experiences with food. I am not going to recommend my diet for anyone else, because one of the first things I have to say about the subject is that every human individual is a separate diet problem. But I am going to try to establish a few principles for your guidance, and more especially to point out the commonest mistakes. I tell about my own mistakes because it happens that I know them more intimately. I was brought up in the South, where it is the custom of people to give a great deal of time and thought to the subject of eating. Among the people I knew, it was always taken for granted that there should be at least one person in the kitchen devoting all her time to the preparing of delicious things for the family to eat. This person was generally a negress, and needless to say, she knew nothing about the chemistry of foods, nothing about their constituents or nutritive qualities. All she knew was about their taste. She had been trained to prepare them in ways that tasted best, and was continually being advised and exhorted and sometimes scolded by the ladies of the family on this subject. At the table, the family and the guests never failed to talk about the food and its taste, and not infrequently the cook would be behind the door listening to their comments, or else she would wait until after the meal for the report which somebody would bring her. In addition to this, the ladies of the family were skilled in what is called fancy cooking. They did not bother with the meats and vegetables, but they mixed batter cakes and made all kinds of elaborate desserts, and exchanged these treasures and the recipes for them with other ladies in the neighborhood. In addition to this, there were certain periods of the week and of the year especially devoted to the preparing and consuming of great quantities of foods. Once every 7 days, the members of the family expressed their worship of their Creator by eating twice as much as usual. And at another time, they celebrated the birth of their Redeemer by overeating systematically for a period of 2 or 3 weeks. Needless to say, of course, the children brought up in such an environment all had large appetites and large stomachs, and their susceptibility to illness was recognized by the setting apart for them of a whole classification of troubles. Children's diseases, they were called. In addition to children's diseases, there were coughs and colds and sore throats and pains in the stomach and constipation and diarrhea, which the children shared with their adults. I had a little more than my share of all these troubles. Always a doctor would be sent for, and always he was wise and impressive, and always I was impressed. He gave me some pills or a bottle of liquid, a teaspoonful every 2 hours, or something like that. I can hear the teaspoon rattle in the glass as I write. I had a profound respect for each and every one of those doctors. He was wisdom walking about in trousers, and whenever he came, I knew that I was going to get well, and I did, which proved the case completely. Then I grew up, and at the age of 18 or 19 became possessed of a desire for knowledge, and took to reading and studying literally every minute of the day and a good part of the night. I seldom let myself go to sleep before 2 o'clock in the morning, and was always up by 7 and ready for work again. I did this for 10 years or so, until nature brought me to a complete stop. During these 10 years, I was a regular experiment station in health. That is, I had every kind of common ailment, and had it over and over again, so that I could try all the ways of curing it, or failing to cure it, and kept on trying until I was sure, one way or the other. I came recently upon a wonderful saying by John Burroughs, which will be appreciated by every author. This writing is an unnatural business. It makes your head hot and your feet cold, and it stops the digesting of your food. This trouble with my digestion began when I was writing my second novel, camping out on a lonely island at the foot of Lake Ontario. I went to see a doctor in a nearby town, and he talked learnedly about dyspepsia. The cause of it, he said, was failure of the stomach to secrete enough pepsin, and the remedy was to take artificial pepsin obtained from the stomach of a pig. He gave me this pig pepsin in a bottle of red liquid, and I religiously took some after each meal. It helped for a time, but then I noticed that it helped less and less. I got so that a simple meal of cold meat and boiled potatoes would stay in my stomach for hours, in spite of any amount of the pig pepsin. I would lie about in misery because I wanted to work, and my accursed stomach would not let me. All the time, of course, I was using my mind on this problem, groping for causes. I found that the trouble was worse if I worked immediately after eating. I found also that it was worse when I was writing books. When I got sufficiently desperate, I would stop writing books and go off on a hunting trip. I would tramp 20 miles a day over the mountains looking for deer, and I would come back at night too tired to think, and in a week or two every trace of my trouble would be gone. So my life regimen came to be, first the writing of a book, and then a hunting trip to get over the effects of it. But as time went on, alas, I noticed the recuperation was more slow and less certain. The working times grew shorter, the hunting times grew longer, until finally I got to a point where I couldn't work at all. I would go to pieces in a few days if I tried it. It was apparently the end of my stomach, and the end of my sleeping, and the end of my writing books. My teeth were decaying, not merely outside but inside. I would have abscesses and most frightful agonies to endure. I would lie awake at night, and it would seem to me that I could feel my body going to pieces, an extremely depressing sensation. I had been trying experiments all this time. I had been going to one doctor after another, and had got to realize that the doctors only treated symptoms. They treated the diseases when they appeared, but nobody ever told you how to keep the diseases from appearing. Why could there not be a doctor who would look you over thoroughly and tell you everything that was wrong with you and how to set it right? A doctor who would tell you exactly how to live, so that you might keep well all the time. I was studying economics and becoming suspicious of my fellow man. It occurred to me that possibly it might be embarrassing to a doctor if he cured all his patients and taught them how to live, so that none of them would ever come to him again. It occurred to me that possibly this might be the reason why preventive medicine, constructive health work, was getting so little attention from the medical fraternity. Two things that plagued me were headache and constipation, and they were obviously related. For constipation, the world had one simple remedy: you took something every night or every morning, and thought no more about it. My stout and amiable grandmother had drunk a glass of Hunyadi water every morning for the last 30 or 40 years, and that she finally died of fatty degeneration of the heart was not connected with this in the mind of anyone who knew her. As for headaches, people would tell you this, that, and the other remedy, and I would try them, that is, unless they happened to be drugs. I was getting more and more shy of drugs. I had some blessed instinct which saved me from stimulants and narcotics. I had never used tea, coffee, alcohol, or tobacco, and in my worst periods of suffering, I never took to putting myself to sleep with chloral, or to stopping my headaches with phenacetin. At the end of 6 or 8 years of purgatory, I came upon a prospectus of the Battle Creek Sanitarium. This seemed to me exactly what I wanted. This was constructive; it dealt with the body as a whole. So I spent a couple of months at the San, and paid them something like $1,000 to tell me all they could about myself. The first thing they told me was that meat eating was killing me. It was perfectly obvious, was it not, that meat is a horrible feeding place for germs, that rotten meat is dreadfully offensive, and likewise digested meat. Consider the excreta of cats, for example. I listened solemnly while Dr. Kellogg read off the numbers of billions of bacteria per gram in the contents of the colon of a carnivorous person. It certainly seemed proper that the author of The Jungle should be a vegetarian, so I became one, and did my best to persuade myself that I enjoyed the taste of the patent meat substitutes which are served in 100-calorie portions in the big sanitarium dining room. There also I met Horace Fletcher, and learned to chew every particle of food 32 times, and often more. I exercised in the sanitarium gymnasium, and watched the sterilized dancing, the men with the men and the women with the women. I was patiently polite with the Seventh-day Adventist religion, and laid in a supply of postage stamps on Friday evening. Finally, and most important of all, I went once a day to the treatment rooms, and had my abdomen doctored alternately with hot cloths and ice. By this means I kept up a flow of blood in the intestinal tract, and stimulated these organs to activity. So my constipation was relieved, and my headaches were less severe, so long as I stayed at the sanitarium, and was boiled and frozen once every day. But when I left the sanitarium and abandoned these treatments, the troubles began to return. Meantime, however, I had written a book in the praise of vegetarianism, a book which has got into the libraries and cannot be got out again. I went on to a new variety of health crank, the real nature cure practitioners. Vegetarianism was not enough, they insisted. The evil had begun long before, when man first ruined his food and destroyed its nutritive value by means of fire. There was only one certain road to health, and that was by the raw food route, the monkey and squirrel diet. I had gone out to California for a winter's rest, and decided I would give this plan a thorough trial. For 5 months I lived by myself, and the only cooked food I ate was shredded wheat biscuit. For the rest, I lived on nuts and salads and fresh and dried fruits, and during this period I enjoyed such health as I had never known in my life before. I had literally not a single ailment. I was not merely well, but bubbling over with health. I had a friend who said it cheered him just to see me walk down the street. I thought that it was entirely the raw food, and that I had solved the problem forever. But I overlooked the fact that during those 5 months I had done no hard brain work, no writing. I went back to writing again, and things began to go wrong. My wonderful raw foods took to making trouble in my stomach, and I assure you that until you try it, you have no idea the amount of trouble that can be made in your stomach by a load of bananas and soaked prunes which had gone wrong. For a year or two I agonized. I could not give up my wonderful raw food diet because I had always before me the vision of those months in California, and I could not understand why it was not that way again. But the time came when I would eat a meal of raw food, and for hours afterwards my stomach would feel like a blown-up football. Then somebody gave me a book by Dr. Salisbury on the subject of the meat diet. Of all the horrible things in the world, a meat diet sounded to me the worst. I had been a vegetable enthusiast for 3 years, and thought of eating meat as you would think of cannibalism. But there has never been a time in my life when I could not hear something new and give it a trial if it sounded well. So I read the books of Dr. Salisbury, which have long been out of print and have been curiously neglected by the medical profession. Salisbury was a real pioneer, an experimenter. He wrote in the days before the germ theory, and so missed his guess regarding tuberculosis, but he perceived that most of the common diseases are caused by dietetic errors, and he set to work to prove it. He showed that hog cholera and army diarrhea are the same disease, and come from the same cause. He took a squad of men and fed them an army biscuit for 2 or 3 weeks, until they were nearly dead, and then he put them on a diet of lean beef and completely cured them in a few days. He did the same thing with one kind of food after another, and in each case he would bring his men as near to death as he dared, and then he would cure them. He showed that meat is the only food which contains all the elements of nutrition, the only food upon which a person can live for an unlimited period. As Salisbury said, beef is first, mutton is second, and the rest nowhere. It was his idea that tuberculosis of the lungs is caused by spores of fermenting starch clogging the minute blood vessels. He claimed that there is an early stage of tuberculosis in which the spores are floating in the bloodstream. He put large numbers of patients upon a diet of lean beef, ground and cooked, and he cured them of tuberculosis. And if one of them would break the diet and yield to a craving for starch or sugar, Salisbury claimed that he could find it out an hour or two later by examining a drop of their blood under the microscope. In his books he described vividly the effects of an excess of starch and sugar in the diet. He called it making a yeast pot of your stomach. And you can imagine how that hit my stomach, full of half-digested bananas and prunes. I tried the Salisbury diet and satisfied myself of this one fact, that lean meat is for brain workers the most easily assimilated of all foods. Salisbury claimed that you could not overeat on meat, but I do not believe there is any food you cannot overeat on. Nor do I believe that anyone should try to live on one kind of food. We are by nature omnivorous animals. Our digestive tracts are similar to those of hogs and monkeys, which eat all varieties of food they can get. One of the common errors of the nature cure enthusiast is to cite the monkey and the squirrel as fruit and nut-eating animals, when the fact is that monkeys and squirrels eat meat when they can get it, and the ardor with which they go bird nesting is evidence enough that they crave it. If there is any race of man which is vegetarian, you will find that it is from necessity alone. The beautiful South Sea Islanders, who are the theme of the raw fooders' ecstasy, spend a lot of their time catching fish, and sometimes they kill a pig, and celebrate the event precisely as Christians celebrate the birth of their Redeemer. From this you may be able to guess my conclusions. As a result of much painful blundering and experimenting, so far as diet is concerned, I belong to no school. I have learned something from each one, and what I have learned from a trial of them all is to be shy of extreme statements and of hard and fast rules. To my vegetarian friends who argue that it is morally wrong to take sentient life, I answer that they cannot go for a walk in the country without committing that offense, for they walk on innumerable bugs and worms. We cannot live without asserting our right to subject the lower forms of life to our purposes. We kill innumerable germs when we swallow a glass of grape juice, or for that matter, a glass of plain water. I shall be much surprised if the advance of science does not some day prove to us that there are rudimentary forms of consciousness in all vegetable life. So we shall justify the argument of Mr. Dooley, who said in reviewing The Jungle that he could not see why it was any less crime to cut off a young tomato in its prime, or to murder a whole cradleful of baby peas in the pod. There is no question that meat eating is inconvenient, expensive, and dirty. I have no doubt that some day we shall know enough to be able to find for every individual a diet which will keep him at the top of his power, without the maintenance of the slaughterhouse. But we do not possess that knowledge at present. At least, I personally do not possess it. I happen to be one of those individuals, there are many of them, with whom milk does not agree, and if you rule out milk and meat, you will find yourself compelled to get a great deal of your protein from vegetable sources, such as peas, beans, and nuts. All these contain a great deal of starch, and thus there is no way you can arrange your diet to escape an excess of starch. Excess of starch, so my experience has convinced me, is the deadliest of all dietetic errors. It is also the commonest of errors, the cause not merely of the common throat and nose infections, but of constipation, and likewise of diarrhea, of anemia, and thus, through the weakening of the bloodstream, of all disorders that spring from this source: decaying teeth and rheumatism, boils, bad complexion, and tuberculosis. Starch foods are the cheapest, therefore they form the common diet of the poor, and are responsible for the diseases of undernourishment to which the poor are liable. On the other hand, of course, there are perfectly definite diseases of overnourishment: high blood pressure, which culminates in apoplexy; kidney troubles, which result from the inability of these organs to eliminate all the waste matter that is delivered to them; fatty degeneration of the heart, or of the liver, or any of the vital organs. You may cause a headache by clogging the bloodstream through overeating, or you may cause it by eating small quantities of food, if those foods are unbalanced, and do not contain the mineral elements necessary to making of normal blood. Whatever the trouble with your health, it is my judgment that in 2 cases out of 3 you will find it dates back to errors in diet. I do not think I exaggerate in saying that a knowledge of what to eat and how much to eat is 2/3 of the knowledge of how to keep yourself in permanent health. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Errors in Diet. Discusses the different kinds of foods, and the part they play in the making of health and disease. It is my purpose in this chapter to lay down a few general principles to aid you in the practical problem of selecting the best diet for yourself. But it must be made clear at the outset that there can be no hard and fast rule. All human bodies are more or less alike, but on the other hand, all are more or less different. Modern civilization has given very few bodies the chance to be perfect. Nearly all have some weakness, some abnormality, and need some special modification in diet to fit their particular problem. The ideal in each case would be a complete study of the individual system. Some day, no doubt, medical science will analyze the digestive juices and the gland secretions of the bloodstream of every human being and say, you need a certain percentage of starch and a certain percentage of protein. You need such and such proportion of phosphorus and iron. You should avoid certain acids, and so on. But at present, we are devoting our science to the task of killing and maiming other people, instead of enabling ourselves to live in health and happiness. So it is that most of those who read this book will be too poor to command the advice of a diet specialist. The best you can do is to get a few general ideas and try them out, watching your own body and learning its peculiarities. Human food contains three elements: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. The proteins are the body-building material, and the foods which are rich in proteins are lean meat, the white of eggs, milk and cheese, nuts, peas, and beans. A certain amount of this kind of food is needed by the body. If it is missing, the body will gradually waste away. If too much of it is taken, the body can turn it into energy-making material, but this is a wasteful process, and the best evidence appears to be that it is a strain upon the system. Experiments conducted by Professor Chittenden of Yale have proven conclusively that men can live and maintain body weight upon much less protein food than previously dietetic standards have indicated. The fats are found in fat meats and dairy products, and in nuts, olives, and vegetable oils. The body is prepared to digest and assimilate a certain amount of fat, no one knows how much. I have found in my own case that I require a great deal less than people ordinarily eat. I have for many years maintained good health upon a diet containing no more fat than one gets with lean meat once or twice a day. I never use butter or olive oil, nor any fat in cooking. My reason for this is that fats are the most highly concentrated form of food, and the easiest upon which to overeat. Excess of fat is a cause, not merely of obesity, but also of boils and pimples and pasty complexion, and other signs of a clogged bloodstream. The third variety of food is the carbohydrates, and of these there are two kinds: starches and sugars. Starch is the white material of the grains and tubers, the principal food element of bread and cereals, rice, potatoes, bananas, and many prepared substances such as cornstarch, tapioca, farina, and macaroni. Starchy foods compose probably half the diet of the average human being. In my own case, they compose about 1/6. So you see to what extent my beliefs differ from the common. Starch is not really necessary in the diet at all. I have a friend who is subject to headaches, and finds relief from them by a diet of meat, salads, and fresh fruits exclusively. The first thing that excess of starch or sugar does is to ferment in the system and cause flatulence and gas. But strange as it may seem, if the excess of starch is perfectly digested and assimilated into the system, the condition may be worse yet, because you may have a great quantity of energy-producing material without the necessary mineral elements which the body requires in the handling of it. If you cremate a human body and study the ashes chemically, you find a score or more of mineral salts. You find these in the blood, and no blood is normal, and no body can be kept normal which does not contain the right percentage of these elements. It is not merely that they are needed to build bones and teeth; they are needed at every instant for the chemistry of the cells. Every time you move a muscle, you fill the cells of that muscle with a certain amount of waste matter. You may prove how deadly this matter is by binding a tight cord about your arm, and then trying to use the arm. We are only at the beginning of understanding the subtle chemistry of the body, but this much we know: the cells transform the waste products, and they are thrown out of the system as ammonia, uric acid, etc., and for this process the blood must have a continuous supply of many mineral salts. So vital are they, and so fatal to health is their absence, that it is far better for you to eat nothing at all than to eat improperly balanced foods, or foods which are deficient in the organic salts. You may prove this to yourself by simple experiment. Put two chickens in separate pens, where nobody can feed them but yourself. Feed one of them on water and white bread, or cornstarch, or sugar, or any energy-making substance which contains little of the mineral elements. Feed the other chicken on plain water. You will find that the one which has the food will quickly become droopy and sickly, its feathers will fall out, it will have what in human beings would be known as headaches, colds, sore throats, decaying teeth, and boils. At the end of a couple of weeks, it will be a dead chicken. The one which you feed on water alone will not be a happy chicken, neither will it be a fat chicken, but it will be a live chicken, and a chicken without disease. I am going later on to discuss the subject of fasting. For the present, I will merely say that a chicken which has nothing but water is living upon its own flesh, and therefore has a meat diet, containing the mineral elements necessary to the elimination of the fatigue poisons. I am going to try not to be dogmatic in this book, and not to say things that I do not know. I confess to innumerable uncertainties about the subject of diet, but one thing I think I do know, and that is that human beings should eliminate absolutely from their food those modern artificial products which look so nice, and are so easy to handle, and are put up in packages with pretty labels, and have been in some way artificially treated to remove the wastes and impurities, including the vital mineral salts. Among such food substances I include lard, and its imitations made from cottonseed oil, white flour, all the prepared and refined cereals, polished rice, tapioca, farina, cornstarch, and granulated and powdered sugar. Any of these substances will kill a chicken in a couple of weeks, and the only reason they take a longer time to kill you is because you mix them with other kinds of foods. But to the extent that you eat them, your diet is deficient. And do not console yourself with the idea that the mineral elements will be made up from the other foods, because you don't know that, and nobody else knows it. Nobody knows just how much of any particular organic salt the body needs. All we know is that the primitive races which ate natural foods enjoyed vigorous health, while the American people, who consume the greatest proportion of the so-called refined foods, have the very best dentists and the very worst teeth in the world. There are many kinds of sugar, found in the sugar cane and the beet and in all fruits. Sugar may also be made from any form of starch. This is glucose, which is put up in cans and sold as an imitation of maple syrup. The ordinary granulated and powdered sugar is made by taking from the natural syrup every trace of mineral elements. So I have no hesitation in saying that the ordinary cane sugar and beet sugar of our breakfast tables and our confectionery stores is not a food, but a slow poison. The causes of the wonderful progress of American dentistry, which is the marvel of the civilized world, are cane sugar, white flour, and the frying pan, each of which dietetic crimes I shall take up in turn. We have the richest country in the world. We eat more food, probably by 50%, and we waste more food, probably by 500%, than any other people in the world. And yet, go to any small farming community in America, and what do you find? You find the teeth of the young children rotting in their heads, and having to be pulled out before their second teeth come. You find these second teeth rotting often before the age of 20. A friend of mine who knows the American farmer sums it up this way: he has two things that he requires if he is to be really respectable and happy. First, he wants to get all the fireplaces in his home boarded up, and all the windows nailed tight. And second, he wants to get all his teeth out, and an artificial set installed. Out of the farmers' wives in my neighborhood, not 1 in 10 keeps her own teeth until she is 30. If you go to the Balkans, where the peasants live on sour milk with grains which they grind at home, or to southern Italy and Sicily, where they live on cheese and black bread and olives, or among savage people, where they hunt and fish and gather the natural fruits, you find old men without a single decayed tooth. There must be some reason for this, and the reason is found in our denatured grocery store foods. The farmer's wife will gather up her eggs and her butter and cheeses and take them to the store and bring back cans of lard and packages of sugar. The farmer will sell his perfectly good wheat and cornmeal and bring back in his wagon cases of refined cereal foods, for which he has paid 10 times the price of the grain. Dentists will tell you that the way candy injures the teeth is by sticking to them and fermenting, forming acids, which destroy the tooth structure. And that may be a part of the reason, but the principal reason why the teeth decay is because the bloodstream is abnormal and is unable to keep up the repairs of the body. Your teeth are living structures, just as much as any other part of you, and they will resist decay if you supply them with the proper nourishment. You need sugar. You need a considerable quantity of it every day. Nature provides this sugar in combination with the organic salts, and also with the precious vitamins, whose function in the body we are only beginning to investigate. All the mineral substances which give the color and flavor to oranges, apples, peaches, grapes, figs, prunes, raisins, all these you take out when you make sugar. Or perhaps you put in some imitations of them made from coal tar chemicals, and then drink them at your soda fountains. So little appreciation has the American farmer's wife of natural fruits that when she preserves them, she considers it necessary to fill them full of cane sugar. In fact, she has a notion that they won't keep unless she cooks them up with sugar. So snobbish are we Americans about our eating that we make the best of our foods into bywords. We make jokes in our comic papers about the boarding house prune, and yet prunes and raisins are among the wholesomest foods we have, and if we fed them to our children instead of cakes and candy and coal tar flavorings, our dental industry would rapidly decline. And the same thing is true of bread. When I was a boy, I thought I had to have hot bread at least twice a day, and if I were called upon to eat bread that was more than a day old, I felt that I was being badly abused by life. I used to read fairy stories in which something called black bread was mentioned. Something obscure and terrible. The symbol of human misery was Cinderella sitting in the ashes and eating a crust of dry black bread. But now, since I have studied diet, I have taken my place with Cinderella. I can afford to buy whatever kind of bread I want. I can have the best white bread piping hot 3 times a day if I want it. But what I eat 3 times a day is a crust of hard, dry black bread. Black bread is the fairy tale name for bread made of the whole grain. It is eaten that way by the peasant because he has no patent milling machinery at his disposal to fan away the life-giving elements of his food. Nearly all the mineral elements of the grain are contained in the outer dark-colored portion. The white part is almost pure starch, and when you use white flour, you are not merely starving your bloodstream, your bones, and your teeth, you are also depriving the digestive tract of the rough material which it is accustomed to handle, and which it needs to stimulate it to action. I am aware that the whole grain products are a trifle less easy of digestion, but we should not pamper and weaken our digestive tract any more than we let our muscles get flabby for lack of action. We should require our stomachs to handle the ordinary natural foods precisely as we accustom our body to react from cold water and to stand honest, hard work. For ages, Japanese peasants have lived on rice, with a little dried fish. Quite recently, there began to spread throughout Japan a mysterious disease known as beriberi. It was especially prevalent in the army, and so the scientists of Japan set out to discover the cause. And it proved to be the modern practice of polishing rice, which takes off the outer coating of the grain. Rice is one of the most wholesome of foods if it is eaten in the natural state. But in order to get it in that state in this country, you have to find a special food store of the health cranks and have to pay a special price for it. You have to pay a higher price for the whole wheat bread, because 99 people out of 100 are ignorant and insist upon having their foodstuffs pretty to look at. Probably you have read sea stories and know the horrors of scurvy. Scurvy and beriberi are similar diseases with a similar cause. The men on the old sailing ships used to have to live on white biscuit and salt meat, and they always knew that to recover from their gnawing illness they must get to port and get fresh vegetables and fruits, especially onions and lemons, which contain the vitamins as well as the salts. But you will see the modern housewife going into the grocery store and surveying the shelves of packaged goods, and in her ignorance picking out the scurvy-making products and frequently paying for them a much higher price than for the health-making ones. Then, when she has got her white flour and her cane sugar and her lard, she will take it home and mix it up and put it in the frying pan, and serve it hot to her husband and children. Nature has so constituted her husband and children that they digest starch before they digest fat. That is to say, the starch is digested mainly in the stomach, while the fat is digested mainly after the food has been passed on into the small intestine. But by frying the starch before it is eaten, the housewife carefully takes each grain of starch and protects it with a little covering of fat. Thus the digestive juices of the stomach cannot get at the starch, and the starch goes down into the small intestine a good part undigested. If some evil spirit, wishing to make trouble for the human organism, had charge of the laying out of our diet, he could hardly devise anything worse than that. And yet, it would be no exaggeration to say that the average American, especially the average farmer, eats out of a frying pan. If his potatoes have to be warmed over, they go into the frying pan. His precious batter cakes and donuts are cooked in the frying pan, and all his precious hot breads are mixed with lard. If it were not for the fact that you cannot broil a beefsteak over a modern gas range, I would tell you that the first step toward health for the average American would be to throw the frying pan out of the window and to throw the cookbook after it. The whole modern art of cooking is largely a perversion, a product of idleness, vanity, and sensuality. It is one of the monstrous growths consequent upon our system of class exploitation. We have a number of idle people with nothing to do but eat, and who demonstrate their superiority to the rest of us by their knowledge of superior foods and superior ways of preparing them. They have the wealth of the world at their disposal, also the services of their fellow man without limit, and they set their fellow man to work to enable them to give elaborate banquets and to sit in solemn state and gorge themselves, and to have a full account of their behavior published in the next morning's newspapers. A great part of this perverse art we owe to what is called the ancient regime. In France, a regime which starved the French peasantry until they were black-skinned beasts hiding in caves and hollowed trees. So it comes about that our modern food depravity parades itself in French names, and American snobbery requires of its devotees a course in the French language sufficient to read a menu card. Needless to say, this elaborate gastronomic art has been developed without any relation to health, or any thought of the true needs of the body. It is one of the products of the predatory system which we can say is absolute waste. Having done my own cooking for the past 25 years, I make bold to say that I can teach anybody all he needs to know about cooking in one lesson of half an hour, and that the total amount of cooking required for a large family can be done by one person in 20 minutes a day. In the first place, a great many foods do not have to be cooked at all, and are made less fit by cooking. In the next place, the only cooking that is ever required is a little boiling, or in the case of meat, roasting or broiling. In the next place, the art of combining foods in cooking is a waste art, because no foods should be combined in cooking. Every food has its own natural flavor, which is lost in combination. And if anybody is unable to enjoy the natural flavors of simply cooked foods, there is one thing to say to that person, and that is to wait until he is hungry. Let him take a 10-mile walk in the open air, and he will have more interest in his next meal. I am not a fanatic, and have no desire to destroy the pleasures of life. I am recommending to people that they should seek the higher pleasures of the intellect, and those pleasures are not found in standing over a cook stove, nor in compelling others to stand over a cook stove. Moreover, I know that the artificial mixing of foods to tempt people's palates is one of the principal causes of overeating, and therefore of ill health, and therefore of the ultimate destruction of the pleasure of life. I went out from the world of cooks before I was 20. I wanted to write a book, and to be let alone while I was doing it. I lived by myself, and found out about cooking by practical experience. On a few occasions since then, I have lived in a house with a servant, and had some cooking done for me, but it was always because somebody else wanted it, and against my protest. In the last 10 years, we have had no servant in our home, and because I want my wife to give her energy to more important things than feeding me, I do my share of getting every meal. We have worked out a system of housekeeping by which we get a meal in 5 minutes, and when we finish it, it takes 3 minutes to clear things away. If I tell you what I eat, please do not get the impression that I am advising you to eat these same things. My diet consists of the foods which I have found, by long experience, agree with me. There are many other foods which are just as wholesome, but which I do not eat, either because they don't happen to agree with me, or because I don't care for them so much. I am fond of fruit, and eat more of that than anything else. It is not a cheap article of diet, but you can save a good deal if you buy it in quantities, as I do. A little later, I'm going to discuss the prices of foods. For breakfast, I eat a slice of whole wheat bread, 3 good-sized apples, stewed, and 8 or 10 dates. It takes practically no time to prepare this breakfast. The bread has to be baked, of course, but this is done wholesale. We buy 4 loaves at a time, and it is just as good at the end of a couple of weeks as when we buy it. When I lived in the world of cooks, I would call for applesauce, which meant that somebody had to pare apples, cut them up, stew them, mix them with sugar, grate a little nutmeg over them, set them on ice, and serve them to me on a glass dish with a little pitcher of cream. But now what happens is that I put a dozen apples in a big saucepan and let them simmer while I'm eating. We have a rule in our family that we do not do any cooking except while we are eating, because if we try it at any other time of the day, we get buried in a book or in a manuscript and forget about it until the smoke causes somebody in the street to summon the fire department. So the apples for my breakfast were cooked during last night's supper, and during the breakfast there will be some vegetable cooking for lunch. At this lunch, which is my square meal, I eat a large slice of beefsteak, say a third of a pound. Jack London used to say that the only man who could cook a beefsteak was the fireman of a railway locomotive, because he had a hot, clean shovel. The best imitation you can get is a hot, clean frying pan. And when you are sure that it is hot, let it get hotter. The whole secret of cooking meat is to keep the juices inside, and to do that you must cook it quickly. When you slap it down on a hot frying pan, the meat is seared and the juices stay inside. And if you do not turn it over until it is almost ready to burn, you don't need to cook it very long on the other side. That is the one secret of cooking worth knowing. It doesn't cost anything and saves time instead of wasting it. As I have never found anybody else capable of learning it, I reserve the cooking of the beefsteaks as one of my family duties. To continue the lunch, a slice of whole wheat bread and a large quantity of some fresh salad, such as celery or lettuce and tomatoes, without dressing. For part of this may be substituted a vegetable, 1 or 2 beets or turnips, cooked during a previous meal and warmed up in a couple of minutes. And we do not throw away the tops of the turnips and beets and celery, we put them on and cook them, and they serve for the next day's meal. If you would eat a large quantity of such greens once a day, you would escape many of the ills that your flesh is at present heir to. Finally, for dessert, an orange and a small handful of raisins, or 1 or 2 figs. The evening meal will be the same as breakfast, except once in a while, when I am especially hungry and want some meat. I am writing this in the winter season, so the fruits suggested are those available in the winter. The menu will be varied with every kind of fruit at the season when it is cheapest and most easily obtained. The beefsteak will appear at about 3 meals out of 4. Occasionally it will be replaced by the lean meat of pork or mutton or by fish. The bread may be replaced by rice or boiled potatoes, either white or sweet, and occasionally by graham crackers. I know that these contain a little fat and sugar, but I try not to be fanatical about my diet, and the rules I suggest do not carry the death penalty. There was a time when I used to allow my friends to make themselves miserable by trying to provide me with special foods when they invited me to a meal. But now I tell them to forget it, and I politely nibble a little of everything, and eat most of what I find wholesome. If there's nothing wholesome, I content myself with a pretense of a meal. If I find myself in a restaurant, I quite shamelessly get a piece of apple or pumpkin pie, omitting most of the crust. As I don't go away from home more than once or twice a month, I do not have to worry about such indulgence. The main thing is to arrange one's home diet on sound lines, and to learn to enjoy the simple and wholesome foods, of which there is a great variety obtainable, and at prices possible to all but the wretchedly poor. In conclusion, since everybody likes to have a feast now and then, I specify that my diet regimen allows for holidays. Assuming that I am your guest for a day, and that you wish to blow me, regardless of expense, here will be the menu. Breakfast: some graham crackers, a bunch of raisins, a can of sliced pineapple in the winter, or a big chunk of watermelon in the summer. Dinner or lunch: roast pork, a baked apple, a baked sweet potato, and some spinach. Supper: lettuce, dates, and a dish of popcorn flavored with peanut butter. Try this next Christmas. P.S. After this book had been put into type, I chanced to be looking over Herbert Quick's illuminating book, On Board the Good Ship Earth. Discussing the importance of certain organic salts to the body, Dr. Quick states, "Animals have been fed as an experiment on foods deficient in phosphorus. For a while they seemed to do well, then they collapsed. It takes only 3 months of a ration without phosphorus to wreck an animal. Individual creatures were killed after a month of this diet, and it was found that the flesh was taking the phosphate, for the phosphorus exists in the body in that form, from the bones to supply its need. In other words, the body was eating its own bones. When this process had robbed the bones to the limit, the collapse came, and the animal could never recover." End of chapter 20.